As I talk about Balzac's novel, Père Goriot, I'd like you to bear in mind the remarks I made about the first novel in the course, Defoe's Moll Flanders, which was a story about a young woman's experience in London, a woman who came from the country. And yet I don't think one can accurately describe that book as a story of an education, but that's the word I'd like to use for Balzac. Here we get a programmatic kind of text, a paradigmatic kind of text about a young man coming from the country into the city to make his fortune, or to put it in more metaphoric terms, to leave the Garden of Eden, and to come into the city, to come into culture. You can imagine what a kind of exemplary experience, what a kind of rite of passage that might be. It's an initiation. And Balzac is one of the first great 19th century writers not only to tell that story, but to measure its cost, that it has a cost. Now, one question I'd like for you to sort of think about as I give this lecture and the next on Père Goriot is, well, why would a writer elect to focus on the young? Why is their story now at the center of the stage? Think back a little bit. Think about traditional literature, that Achilles and Odysseus are not young. Even Hamlet is over 30. And yet, what we call the Bildungsroman, which I'm going to talk about later in more detail, always focuses on the affairs of the young. This will be Balzac's Père Goriot, the most traditional novel we've yet encountered in this course. I intentionally wanted to sort of open up the picture by looking at Moll Flanders and then Tristram Shandy and then Les Liaisons Dangereuses, just to make it clear, because I think it surprises many people to discover just how capacious, how exploratory, how wide-ranging, how unpredictable, how surprising the novel form, the novel as a form, might be. Because most of us think of a novel as a kind of slice of life, as the story of a person's experiences against a social backdrop. And we get that model essentially from the 19th century, and I would say that we get it largely from Balzac, that he is the first to sort of really establish what a realist novel would be. He is often hailed as the supreme realist of the 19th century. I think he saw himself exactly along those lines. Others, even in his own lifetime, and certainly since, have had a little trouble with that term realism. I'm not interested in definitions as such, but I think it's worth noting that the great poet Baudelaire said that he always found that Balzac's work, far from being realistic, was visionary. What on earth is visionary? What does that mean? To somehow deliver a world that is beyond the retinal vision of most of us? I hope that as we continue to look at this novel, that you will end up with a more complex picture of what a realist novel might be like, how insufficient or inadequate the notion of a slice of life is to take the measure of what we've got here. Balzac is writing in the third and fourth decade of the 19th century. He was born at the very end of the 18th century. And so he has a memory of revolutionary France and of the Bourbon Restoration in 1815, the moment when the Napoleonic project sort of yields to a much more conservative kind of royalist France. And then, in particular, I think the moment that stamps his work is the coronation of Louis-Philippe in 1830, which is the beginning of a kind, it's called the Roi Bourgeois occasionally, the bourgeois king, and it's the beginning of a new age in France. It's a France that I think can be rightly qualified as a capitalist culture. It's a time of great speculators and entrepreneurs, and I think it is not totally irresponsible or far-fetched to compare it, let's say, to the 1980s in America with the sort of manic development schemes and the takeovers, or even the kind of bookkeeping done by Enron in this country just a few years ago. That you get a sense of the kind of crazed business atmosphere, particularly located in one of the characters of this novel, the Baron Nucingen, who was the great entrepreneur, the great capitalist speculator of the novel. So this novel really gives us a lot of history about the development of Paris as a kind of capitalist center, which sort of lagged behind London, which had already been established that way. Further, the novel gives us a culture where material goods matter, they count. Consumerism already exists in this novel from 1834, And at one key passage, at least key for me because it's such an interesting parallel, the young woman Delphine and her father Goriot offer Rastignac, who was the hero of the book, the young man from the provinces who comes to Paris to study law, he's offered an elegant, exquisite apartment. It's a surprise gift. He didn't know it. And Delphine, when she gives it to him, explicitly compares this gift to the gifts that were made to the knights of old from the Middle Ages, the knights who received from their ladies armor and swords and horses. And what she says to him is that today the weapons for success include a fine apartment, elegant clothes, elegant furnishings, a carriage, etc. And so you get a feeling that, well, the rules haven't really changed. It's just that the way you meet the rules have changed and what is required has changed, and it's all materialist. It all has to do with specific kinds of goods that people need. The central player in this book, I've said that Rastignac is the major protagonist. The central player arguably is Paris. That Paris obsesses Balzac, as it did other writers in the 1820s and 30s and 40s, that it became a kind of popular literary subject in its own right. And what will, I think, surprise you is that the figure who matters to Balzac as he's talking about Paris is not at all an urban writer, but it's the great American novelist James Fenimore Cooper. The Leatherstocking Tales were a huge success all throughout Europe, and particularly in France. And so, to put these things together, Paris is compared in a memorable simile in this novel to an American forest where Hurons and Illinois Indians struggle for existence. As I said, there were many novels written in the 30s and 40s and the 19th century about Paris, where Paris was one of the titles. One of them was Les Esclaves de Paris, the slaves of Paris. One was Le Pavé de Paris, the pavement of Paris. One, which I love, is called Les Mohicans de Paris, the Mohicans of Paris. Certainly the Cooper reference is there. So these writers are interested in making this city more available to their own readership, a city that is evolving, that is changing, as I said, becoming much more distinctly a kind of entrepreneurial business culture, making that more knowable to a readership. It's a point worth making, the one that I just made. That is to say, in order to find out how the city you live in is changing, you might read a novel. Now, who on earth would say that today? Who would go to a novel to find out what the culture of today is like? Because the electronic revolution today has changed so much of that. We go to the internet, we go to other places. But then the novel had this kind of remarkable role. And this too, in the larger sense, is education, not necessarily that of the protagonist, but that of the reader. Balzac was an exemplary Parisian in the sense that he loved the city. He was obsessed by the city. He saw the city as a labyrinth that he wanted to explore. And he's well known for walking the city streets all night long. He would give himself gigantic cups of coffee, black coffee, and he would have his little carnet, his notebook in his hand, and he would walk through the streets taking notes, knowing that this was gathering material for the novels that he wanted to write. He wanted his novels, and I pluralize that, to be really he called them the equivalent of the état civil, of the civil service. They were supposed to be a kind of cumulative map of his own culture, of his own civilization. The title that he gave the large, sort of cumulative group of novels is called La Comédie Humaine, the human comedy, although comédie also means drama. And he clearly had it in mind Dante's Divine Comedy as his sort of religious counterpart for the kind of secular grand text that he was writing. Balzac himself has a kind of grandeur, not just in his project to deliver the entire world in fiction, but also in his own person. If you've ever seen a sculpture of this man, there's something gigantic, colossal about him. He's huge, he's very fat, he looks a little bit like a bull. There's a brilliant sculpture of Rodin devoted to this man, sometimes in the nude, sometimes with a Roman toga, and he's a figure of considerable authority. There's a kind of imperial feeling about him, but also one sees kind of raw volition written in his face. So all of that, I think, is worth knowing as a kind of sense of power that matters to this man. It matters in his view of life in Paris, and it also matters in his own makeup. La Comédie Humaine is the title for the entire series. Isn't that unusual? I mean, a man writes tons and tons of novels, and he decides that they're all ultimately what, from the vantage point of heaven or of the afterlife, they're all ultimately one great novel. And this is a kind of remarkable discovery that he realized in mid-career, actually in fairly early career, right about the time he wrote Père Goriot, that all of the books that he was to write about Paris could be interlocking. They could be part of one grand, evolving, sort of massive body of work, one summa that would eventually appear. And one of the interesting ramifications of that is that he will take the same characters, not all of them, but many of the characters from one book and then bring them into another book with the liberty of changing them so that the books themselves are to some extent prismatic. We see one aspect of a character in one book, and then we meet someone whom we know to be familiar in another novel, but that person has altered or evolved. And so the young man, the student in Père Goriot, Rastignac, will in fact reappear in later books. And when I teach this book, I always ask my students, can you quite imagine what he's going to be like after the education that he receives in Père Goriot? And I may come back to that later, but even if I don't, I'd like you to wonder about that as we go. Realist is the term I've used. Visionary is the term that Baudelaire used. Balzac probably would have said he was predominantly scientific. He thought that his works had parallels with the new laws of science, in particular biology and botany and zoology, where whole species were being sort of typed or typologized, defined. I think he thought about the human animals in the city along the same lines. Of course, the science that we would probably evoke there would be sociology. And as a sociologist, he's a writer whose work reappears, it seems to me, or stamps the further productions of writers ranging from Zola to Dreiser or Updike, or even in our own time, Don DeLillo. Balzac's ideological commitments are not always easy to make out, in part because they appear to be so contradictory. He explicitly, consciously thought himself a conservative. He defended the church and the throne in his books. But as all of us know, one's explicit conscious convictions are not always what run deepest. It's particularly something you may discover when you look at art and literature, so that one's professed beliefs sometimes get turned around or imploded in the actual work. And in fact, in Balzac's novels, it seems to me that he's most drawn to, most fascinated by the outsiders, even the criminals, the people who break the rules. He would never have admitted that, it seems to me, and yet that's what the texts themselves teach us. Balzac, as defender of the church and throne, would not appear to be a man, for example, whose work would have any interest, let's say, to people like Marx and Engels. But it did. Engels is on record having said that he learned most of what he had to figure out about the workings of the economy and socioeconomic conditions in mid-19th century France by reading Balzac. And that's because Balzac registers, as Defoe did a century earlier, he registers a changing economic order. It's a time of upheaval, it's a time of change, and Balzac, I think, is our great mapmaker here. His major literary process is a bit boring. It's called exposition, which means that, and particularly for students who try to read Balzac in French, or readers who read him in French, but their French is not perfect, this is hard going because the man has an endless vocabulary of adjectives, and he lays out for the first quarter of his book the entire setting so that he can set this up and then move ahead. Here too, he thinks of himself as a scientist. For example, he thinks that there is a kind of causal relationship, a deterministic causal relationship, between the setting, the environment on the one hand, and the people and their actions on the other hand. This story is going to focus in part on a boarding house in Paris called the Maison Vauquer. And in a rather famous paragraph, Balzac compares the name of the lady who runs it, Madame Vauquer. He compares her personality to the boarding house. And he claims that once you understand one, you understand the other. Her whole person, in short, provides a clue to the boarding house, just as the boarding house implies the existence of such a person as she is. We tend to smile a little bit today at the kind of tightness of that analogy, but Balzac, I think, really did believe in it. Well, once you think of Balzac as that sort of tightly constructed, you may go away with the feeling, or at least initially have the feeling, that there are not going to be any surprises in this book. After all, if the man is going to lay out the environment with the kind of thoroughness, and he is thorough, that he does, then probably the people themselves are utterly predictable. That's where you've got to be on your guard. The sign in front of this boarding house is called the Maison Vauquer, and in English it says lodgings for ladies and gentlemen, etc. Etc. What does that mean? The French is pension bourgeoise pour femmes, hommes et autres. Ladies, gentlemen, and others. And we will see as we continue with this lecture that there may be something beyond men and women who are talked about in this book. Well, Balzac is one of our great detective story writers. He doesn't literally write detective stories in the way that Edgar Allan Poe does, and yet he uses the model of the detective story inasmuch as he uses it as a kind of template for exploring what people's inner passions are about. That when he sees a character, he sees that character as a kind of sleuth might. And so even minor characters are described in terms like this. And I want you to think about what kind of mindset is at work that would see people and think these kinds of questions. This is the dried-up old lady who lives in this boarding house also, Mademoiselle Michonneau. What acid had consumed the feminine curves of this creature? She must once have been pretty and well-formed. Was it vice? Grief? Greed? Had she loved too well? Had she been a dealer in second-hand clothing or simply a courtesan? Each of these questions could be the seed of a novel or of a short story. Each of these minor characters could be, in fact, the subject of another story. And what I'm trying to get at is that every character in Balzac contains a story. Balzac has a sense of the plenitude of his figures, the mysteries. He looks at them and he says, what made them what they are? What kind of story could we uncover here? What kind of unfurling, what kinds of strange paths led to the people that we see? There's something stunning and I think robust, and I think actually admirable, about this kind of curiosity towards one's fellows. I say that because I think most of us look at the people that we see and their silhouettes, their pasteboard masks. It doesn't occur to us to wonder what in fact produced them, what kind of passional history has in fact led to these people. There is nothing sort of lame or limp or inert in Balzac's world. Flaubert once famously said about Madame Bovary, which I'll talk about in a later lecture in this course, c'est un livre sur rien. It's a book about nothing. Balzac would have been incapable of writing about that. Likewise, in both Stendhal and in Flaubert, you get the theme of ennui, of boredom. No one is bored in Balzac. His world is bursting with passion, with excitement. In one very marvelous passage, he describes Paris as an ocean. I want you to hear that because it says something about terms that matter to me, which are terms of surface and depth. Paris is an ocean. Throw in the plummet, you will never reach bottom. Survey it, describe it. However conscientious your survey and careful your chart, however numerous and concerned to learn the truth the explorers of this sea may be, the explorers of this sea. That is exactly what the novelist is. There will always be a virgin realm, an unknown cavern, flowers, pearls, monsters, things undreamed of, overlooked by the literary divers. This is remarkably picturesque, exotic language, and that's how he describes this boarding house. Most people would think of a boarding house as the most boring, uninteresting, innocuous, inert topic that you could have for a novel. Not so for Balzac. He thinks of it instead as an unknown cavern filled with remarkable discoveries, and that, of course, is going to be the project of this book, is to explore just those matters. Balzac wants to salute the earlier texts of the 19th century and earlier still. Père Goriot can be read as a rewrite of King Lear, a man who was cannibalized in some sense by his daughters. But it is also the case that Balzac has in mind Walter Scott, who wrote very idealistic tales of adventure for young people, of people living up to very high moral codes. And Balzac consciously sees himself tackling the other side of that equation. Not people living up to codes, people failing to live up to codes, people compromising codes, people compromising themselves, or to put it in the crassest economic terms I know, sellout. That's going to be this man's great theme. I think all of you will agree that is a modern theme, not the theme of high ideals, but the theme of human beings failing to live up to them, trying to slither and slide and make their way around these stern or severe laws that, in fact, in this case, Rastignac, having been brought up in the country, that they've been told that this is the right way to behave, then they enter Paris and something quite different happens. They realize that these laws no longer apply or that they themselves are unable to live by them. And so I'm at that point now right back to the Bildungsroman, to the notion of the novel of formation, which is what that word means in German. Bildung means formation. It's a tradition that is very powerful in 19th century Europe and England. It was started by Goethe in the education stories of Wilhelm Meister, and then we see it in other French novelists of the 19th century, Balzac, but also Stendhal and Flaubert. And we see it in writers like Charlotte Brontë. I think Jane Eyre is a Bildungsroman. We see it, of course, all over Dickens. Great Expectations is one of the great Bildungsroman in the 19th century. As I said at the beginning of this lecture, what does it mean to center your story on the adventures of the young? It seems so self-evident to us, and particularly I think in America. This is a country of the young. As someone who is not at all young anymore, but I still teach the young, I've been thinking a lot about, well, what are the consequences of that? And one consequence, I don't think it was intended, but it is inevitable, is that the story of the old becomes either marginalized or backgrounded, or in fact, one could say that if your story is about the fortunes and adventures of the young, it could well be the case that the old are going to be devalued, or in fact, in some figurative sense, put away. And I believe that Père Goriot is one of the great stories about just those moves. It's a kind of paradigmatic story in that regard also about the fate of the old, or to put it in a more familial sense, the fate of fathers in this new economic order. So Rastignac's move to Paris from the country to study law is an exemplary story. It deals with the great question that has always faced, we think always, I'd argue that it starts to be an important question now in the 19th century when Balzac is writing, has faced the young, which is how to succeed. The French word for that is parvenir. You would have to look hard in earlier novels. You'll find a few, but not very many. In the 18th century, some, and then before that, none, where the notion of succeeding is the central gambit in the novel. We think of it as self-evident. We probably think of it as universal and timeless, but it's not. In the traditional societies, the young didn't think about succeeding. The class lines were such, they were drawn out so clearly that people took their place. That is the way older societies have always functioned. That is certainly not the way America has functioned, nor is that the way that Balzac's Paris functions at the time that he is writing. The Bildungsroman, therefore, where the young are seeking to succeed and to make their way, is also a remarkably economical scheme in this sense that when the young, particularly if they are innocent, they come from the country, they come from a kind of traditional setting, and they enter this city, which is a new kind of culture, a culture of the cash nexus, then what happens is that their encounter, sometimes their collision, sometimes their capsizing against the system, writes large for us the sort of appearance of a new ethos, the difficulties, the wreckage that it brings with it, or the kinds of adaptation that it brings with it. So that the novel of formation, Bildungsroman, very quickly in some instances, becomes the novel of deformation, of what a young person has to do in order to make it in the modern city that he moves into. These are often books about liminal experiences, and that is going to be the case with Rastignac in this particular novel. And in the experiences and the adventures that he has, we're going to see that much of the luggage, as it were, that he brings with him is luggage, in fact, that he cannot afford. Oddly enough, it's a metaphor that I frequently use when I talk to my students at Brown about you have brought much more luggage with you to this campus than you're aware of. It's much more than you see when you hang up your clothes and put your shirts away and take your books out of their boxes. You don't see your luggage until you have to get rid of it. And that's, of course, what's going to happen in this novel, is that Rastignac is going to measure the extent to which the beliefs that have been indoctrinated in him, that he thinks have to do with any kind of moral or spiritual rectitude, those beliefs are not sustainable. They're too expensive. They're something like a luxury item that's not going to be maintainable. And so the young man, the young law student, is on the lookout when he gets to Paris for the best way to succeed. And of course, what he's been told, the reason that his family has very little money, living under straitened circumstances, they're making a considerable sacrifice to send their son to Paris to go to law school. He has been told that, of course, it means you study hard, you hit the books. I'm sure many of you have either heard or passed on that message yourselves. Hit the books, do your best in your courses, that will be the key to success. And that's how the boy begins. He's living at this boarding house with this strange bevy of assorted creatures, and he is a studious person going to classes, going to lectures. Soon enough, he is about to discover that that will not wash, that won't cut it, that the idea of simply carrying out the educational design that his parents had in mind, that he had in mind when he came, that's not going to be a formula for making it. Or let's put it like this, that the adventures that he has, the encounters that he has, the people that he runs into are going to jostle his thinking, jolt his thinking, change his way of thinking, make him reconsider what it will take to succeed, parvenir, to get ahead. And the book, therefore, the title, Père Goriot, sometimes it's called Old Goriot, and I think that's a mistranslation. It should be called Father. Obviously, that's what Père means. Father Goriot. The book is about a search for fathers, which means a search for authority. What is the authority I should follow? What are the rules that matter? What is the behavior that should be mine? And the book is going to offer him, in fact, a number of candidates for that authority. And they won't even all be males. But it won't just be Goriot who is Père Goriot. There'll be others as well. The young man, he comes from a noble family, even if they're not well off, makes his way into several elegant drawing rooms because of the connections, the family connections that he has. And in particular, he goes into the drawing room of a Madame de Restaud, and then he goes into the ballroom, or the drawing room rather, of his very elegant, very well-placed, very powerful cousin, Madame de Beauséant. And Balzac writes, after the boy has been to each of these places and seen the kind of elegant, rich, dazzling people who make their way in and out and live a life that's so different from the grungy law school lectures that he goes to, he's seen a kind of life that is very seductive and that seems to have no connection with the career that he's planning for. And Balzac writes, between Madame de Restaud's blue boudoir and the pink drawing room of Madame de Beauséant, he had made 3 years advance in that Parisian law, which is never mentioned, although it constitutes a higher social jurisprudence which, well learned and carefully practiced, is a high road to success. And so we realize that the education here is not going to be the straight and narrow, hit the books, go to the lectures, take your exams. Instead, this search for authority, for the right way to live, is closer to what Cooper had talked about. It is a trip into the wilderness, and the question is, will there be a leather stocking or a natty bumppo to guide him? Thank you. In this second lecture on Père Goriot, I want to remind you of one of the oldest metaphors we have of the modern city, a jungle. Well, Balzac doesn't call Paris a jungle, but as I said, he calls it a forest. And in the novel, we easily see that it's a place where the cash nexus, or the sort of economic relationships, replace everything else. In particular, they replace or destroy family ties. So the question that I'd like to have you sort of puzzle over as I give this second lecture is that, well, could you reimagine family altogether? Could you reconceive it in what we now realize is a rather impersonal, anonymous setting? Now, this novel's title, Père Goriot, tells you that it's about a father, and it's about a man named Goriot, and it's about the fate of fathers in a changing world. And it's as equally the case, as I've said, that Lear is one of the models that Balzac has in mind. But it's more complex than that. In other words, Lear, we know, is a kind of grand heroic figure, even though there's a certain amount of crazy comedy in Shakespeare's play. But not of the sort that you have in Balzac. That Balzac gives us a figure in Goriot who is both sublime and grotesque. At one point, Balzac calls Goriot a Christ of paternity, le Christ de la paternité. Well, that certainly sounds fairly magnified and very dignified, making him a kind of candidate for tragic stature. But in another passage not far from there, he calls him canine. And for most good readers, I think canine absolutely sticks. You get the feeling that there's something also monstrous and grotesque, strange and sort of retarded about this old man as well. The book really is a kind of object lesson in parenting. We have that, I think, rather awful modern term, successful parenting. Heaven knows this would be a novel that would dissuade you that such a thing was possible. Goriot, in any event, has not been much of a father. He's been a very loving father, and you could argue that that's been his problem. That perhaps he has spoiled his children by giving them too much money. He has doted on them. His wife died when the children were very, very young. If you wanted to be a bit more cynical, you might argue that he has tried to buy his children. He's provided them with great material wealth, enabling each one of them to make advantageous marriages. And now each of them is rich and fashionable, but they're embarrassed by the old man who's the source of the money. And that's in part because this old man wasn't born rich. Balzac, in one of his sort of asides, gives us the history of Goriot. And it's a little capitalist fable of its own about a man who made his fortune during the revolutionary times. And in particular, he was a figure of considerable sharpness and cunning back then when he was a young man, had a sharp eye for deals that might be made, particularly during the kind of murky times of Napoleonic France. And he makes these strange sort of trade deals where he gets grain on the cheap from Russia. He wiggles around the law. He makes a bundle of money. And of course, this is the money that is then spent on the spoiling and educating and the marrying of his two daughters. They are beautiful. As I've said, they're rich. Each of them is miserable. Anastasie is being bled dry by her very stylish lover. She's married to a man who's an aristocrat. It's a very, I think, loveless marriage. And she's wild about this other young man, Maxime, who is one of Balzac's, he keeps coming back in book after book. He's a complete rake. He's taking advantage of Anastasie. He's constantly getting money from her. And of course, she doesn't have it because she can't ask her husband for it. So she's getting it from her father. And the other daughter, Delphine, is married to this man whom I evoked in the first lecture, the Baron Nucingen, who's from Germany. Some people have said he's modeled on a figure like Rothschild, the man who was the great entrepreneur, the speculator, or in the book, who, in fact, it turns out, doesn't really have much cash with him because he's got a fortune invested in all of these shady schemes, his real estate schemes. Needless to say, Delphine does not love him at all. It's a marriage exclusively for money. And the plot of the book entails that Rastignac, the student, meets both of these women, not knowing that they are, in fact, Goriot's daughters, because they live in elegant Paris. Meets them, and particularly, he woos Delphine, who returns his feelings. And so this would be the kind of most immediate erotic plot of the book, is that he perhaps is going to have a love affair. He can't marry Delphine. She's married to Nucingen. That doesn't seem to be a problem anyway. But he might have an affair with her. One of the stranger turns of the book is that this makes the father, Goriot, remarkably happy. It's as if he's getting his own jollies, and I want to go further, his own sexual jollies, if in fact his daughter, who is married to this corpulent, very unattractive Alsatian guy who's making all this money, if she would have a dashing young lover, this young boy from the provinces. That's one plot. There's another love plot as well that I'll talk about a little bit more in a second too, which is that at the boarding house, there is this penniless young girl living with her aunt, whose name is Victorine. She's not a very interesting character. Balzac really can be a little bit one-dimensional in drawing these kinds of figures. But she has her eyes also on this dashing young student, and you can tell that too is a kind of nascent love arrangement. I'll come back to that. I want to return to the other point I made about the Christ of paternity, le Christ de la paternité, and to take the Christ dimension of this rather seriously, that this is a story, I believe, from Balzac's point of view, about the passion with a capital P, that this is about the fate of love as really not far from crucifixion. Because this man Goriot loves to idolatry his two daughters. And I said idolatry, but it also can seem monstrous at times, that his daughters seem to be the only conduit for him through which affection can pass. They're the only stimulus that really exists for him. He, therefore, is one of Balzac's great monomaniacs. He's got one sort of trigger, one button. He's a one-issue man, and that's his daughters. So there are scenes, for example, when horrendous, cataclysmic things happen in the boarding house. People are arrested, people are thrown out, the fortunes of everyone are changed, and Goriot has zero reaction to it. He's like a cretin. He has no reaction at all. The only remark he makes is, "I'm having dinner tonight with my daughter." And that's enough. That makes him extremely happy. Well, things don't go well. The daughters have an insatiable need for money. Goriot enters, we learn, we see this as all part of the exposition, has entered the boarding house as a reasonably well-to-do man, having married off his daughters, no reason to worry that things are going to go badly, not anticipating that they are going to have a kind of steady open line of money coming from him to them. He cannot say no to them. He doesn't know how to. And so as he becomes increasingly impoverished, this is very interesting. It's really hierarchical in France in that system. He moves up from one floor to the next to the next. These are ascending kinds of poverty. And when the novel actually opens, he's more or less on top, living in something that's not far from a garret. That's the state of his poverty. And of course, this makes him even less welcome to visit his two daughters, who are ashamed of him, even though he's been the source of their money. He's got a little bit of money left, not much. Well, it turns out as well that all of these raids on this man and this increasing poverty that he's experiencing and the pain that he experiences, that he no longer has adequate funds to help his daughters out, and he begins to have great misgivings at having mismarried the two daughters. All of this leads, not surprisingly, to him becoming sick, and then really sick, and then fairly early on, the reader understands that this man is dying. There too, you have to think symbolically. I mean, in the sense that this is all part of what it means to be a father in this particular novel. This is the fate that is meted out to fathers. And he expects, not fully, but wants to be able to expect, that now that he's becoming weak and now that he is perhaps dying, that at least his daughters will come and return some of the affection he has lavished on them and tend to him as he sort of begins to exit the world. Well, they don't come. They're only interested, it seems, in the money. Here, of course, is the Lear story, This is the Lear story without Cordelia. It only seems to have Goneril and Regan. And he's waiting in vain for his two daughters to come to his bedside as he is dying. And these are among the most moving, poignant, and sort of heartbreaking pages of the novel. They're also some of the clearest from an ideological point of view, because he makes these remarkable utterances about, again, the fate of fatherhood. Now, I'll read one or two of them to you. You'll see how graphic they are. He tells this to Rastignac. Don't marry, he says to him. Do not have children. You give them life, they give you death in return. You bring them into the world, and they push you from it. Balzac is not always terribly subtle, so that's a pretty straightforward kind of, but also drastic, extremist kind of remark, and it's not really far off the mark in this novel. He understands that he is perhaps paying the price of having loved them too much. He even thinks of it as a sin that he's expiating. But as he gets sicker and sicker, he gets more and more hysterical, and at one point, when he's in terrible, terrible pain, he's asking that they open up his head to relieve the pressure. He shrieks out, my daughters, Anastasie, Delphine, I must see them. Send the police to fetch them. Compel them to come. Justice is on my side. Everything is on my side. Natural affection and the law as well. I protest. The country will go to ruin if fathers are trampled underfoot. Hope you can hear that moves from being just a kind of emotional outcry, which is perfectly understandable, into a kind of ideological critique. He says, the law is there to defend fatherhood, that the country will go underfoot if people in my position are treated as I'm being treated. It's as if Balzac is absolutely doing his level best for you to see the dimensionality of this drama, that this is not just the fate of Goriot, it's an exemplary fate, and it's a tragic fate about where France is headed, about what the problems are in this new culture, as I said, of a sort of cash ethos. Well, that will, for the moment, take me through the Goriot part of this. I want now to return to Rastignac. I mean, he's the one who is witnessing all of this. And I started out by saying, well, this is a Bildungsroman. More than Mal Flanders, it's really a story about education. What is he learning? I mean, what do you learn from watching a man being treated this way and suffering in this way? And I want now to take a step back and say that, well, in addition to the novel being called Père Goriot, it's got a batch of people, I referred to this at the end of my last lecture, who are all sort of candidates for father figures, or mentors at the very, very least. If Goriot is one, and I still haven't answered what you're supposed to learn there, I want you to puzzle that one. The other mentor would be this woman whom I mentioned, who is his elegant and wealthy cousin, Madame de Beauseant, who is what the French would call a grande dame, and she has a very elegant house in Paris, an hôtel particulier, and she is the one whom he visits in order to get some advice. He says at one point, un bout de parenté ne ferait pas de mal. A bit of relationship, of family relationship, of kinship, would do me a bit of good here. And therefore she takes to this country cousin of hers and tries to give him some advice. She is well connected. She knows all of elegant Paris, what is called le beau monde in French. And she tells him, you can use my name as an Ariadne's thread. That's her own phrase, as un fil d'Ariane. It's a marvelous reference. Ariadne's thread refers back to the mythological story of Theseus in the labyrinth, who found his way into and out of the labyrinth by using the thread that Ariadne, the girl who loved him, gave him. And it suggests that Paris is a labyrinth as well as a forest, as well as a jungle, and that this name of hers, this elegant name, this powerful name, will open doors for him, as it indeed does. It makes him gets him taken quite seriously, precisely by the two Goriot daughters, who are each interested in climbing even higher up the social ladder, particularly Delphine, who's married to the entrepreneur, which gives her tons of money, at least for a while until he puts it all in investments. But it doesn't give her the same social status as her sister Anastasie does. So all of a sudden, Rastignac, this law student, has a certain amount of cachet, a certain amount of style, because he is related to Madame de Beauseant. But she doesn't just give him her name. She also gives him some advice. And the advice is remarkably shrewd and cynical. She tells him, if you want to succeed in Paris, then here's what you have to do. You have to use others, and in particular, use women. It's interesting advice coming from a woman. Use women. Get women to love you. Get women who can do favors for you. But use them, and this is her image, as pack horses. And above all, she says, never, never open your heart to them. Keep your heart closed. Be conniving, be cunning, essentially be a mask. I want you to think about that advice of hiding the heart, because you remember when I referred to the minor characters that Balzac was sort of examining, and he says, what passions had caused her to be this way? What had her prior life been? It's as if the thrust of Balzac's writing is to go behind the mask, behind the surface, and open up and tell the passional drama. And yet the advice that this woman is saying is, that's what you've got to protect. That's what you've got to hide. I think all of us are familiar with this kind of dialectic. Can you expose your heart? What sort of risk are you taking if you do? Well, there is a third mentor, and I've held him off to now because I want to spend a good bit of the rest of this lecture talking about him. He almost takes over the novel. His name is Wuthering. He also lives in the boarding house. He is always described in satanic terms. He's probably based on Milton's Satan. He is a master criminal in disguise living in this boarding house. His actual name is Trompe-la-Mort. That's what he's called by his cronies, which is cheat death. And he takes a remarkable interest in Rastignac. He is the sphinx of the novel, inasmuch as he is impenetrable. No one can read him or see through him, but he is clairvoyant. He is omniscient. He understands and sees through everybody else, and people have argued that there's no way to. He's clearly a kind of figure for Balzac. He's the omniscient figure in the novel. Balzac's the omniscient figure who writes the novel. He proposes to this young student, whom he sort of takes under his care. It's a little bit tricky. At first, the two of them are sort of on edge with each other, but it even looks like they're going to have a duel. But then he calms the boy down, because he's pretty hot-headed, the student. Calms him down and says he's got plans for him. He has noticed, Wuthering has noticed, that the young girl, Victorine, who's penniless, is really quite in love already with the student. But what the rest of us don't know, and what Wuthering knows, is that not only is she penniless because her rich father won't give her any money, we also realize that the rich father has put her aside because he has a son whom he dotes on and who's going to get the entire inheritance. So the girl, therefore, is living penniless with her aunt in this boarding house. But no problem for Wuthering. He can fix this. All that has to happen is for the son that is doted on to die. That's no problem either. He can be killed. No problem either. Because what Wuthering is going to set up, he knows that the son is hot-headed. He happens to have a friend who's a military man, a friend who's developed this special little trick of a poisoned sword. Sounds a lot like Hamlet here. And that this friend is going to insult the son. There will be a duel. The man will use his trick. The son will be dead. The daughter will then be taken back into the wealthy father's graces. The daughter is in love with Rastignac. She will offer to marry Rastignac. He will become a rich man. And then, only then, after this nice little sequence has taken place, Rastignac will give money, a little bit, a portion of it, to his old buddy Wuthering, who set this whole thing up. Well, you can see why this man is called satanic. I mean, he's really pulling all the strings. He is equivalent, really, to fate itself. What's in it for him, you might say? I mean, what is he going to do with his portion of the money? Well, he has a plan. His plan is to go to the American South, to buy himself a passel of slaves, to become Mr. 4 Millions, and then he says no one is going to ever ask him about who he is or what he's done. It's an interesting view of retirement in America. He is the Nietzschean figure of the novel. As I said, he almost runs away with the novel. And what I'm basing that on are the remarkable passages that he delivers himself of as he lectures, it's really close to a lecture, to the young student about what the student's prospects are if he stays with the straight and narrow and continues along the path of being a law student. It's an almost computerized printout about what the odds are and how bad they are for succeeding. I'll read you just a little of it to give you a sense of the flavor of it. He realizes that this young man, he knows he's been going to these parties with these elegant people, he realizes that this young man's got some fire in his belly. We're as hungry as a wolf, our little teeth are sharp, how shall we set about providing for the pot? We have the code, capital C, the law code, Blackstone, etc. We have the code to swallow first. It's not amusing, it teaches us nothing, but it has to be done. A little bit further on, first 2 years drudgery in Paris, looking at the goodies we're greedy for, all of the fine things we'd like to have, the ladies that we'd like to go out with, restaurants we'd like to go to, balls, gambling. Looking at the goodies we're greedy for, but never laying hands on them. And then he gives him, as I said, the printout. At the age of 30, you'll be a justice at 1,200 francs a year if you haven't thrown your gown to the nettles before then. When you reach 40, you will marry some miller's daughter worth about 6,000 livres a year. Thanks again. At 40, you'll probably be an attorney general. And he says a little bit later, I have the honor to point out to you, moreover, that there are only 20 attorney generals in France, and that you aspirants to that rank are 20,000 strong, among whom are rascals who would sell their families to climb one rung. And then the next installment, 50,000 young men at this very moment are in your position. Now you remember, get the ratio here, the number of positions available and the number of candidates who are ready to kill each other to get it, and then are racking their brains to find a quick road to success, parvenir. There are as many of you as that. You may judge of the efforts you must make and of the bitterness of the struggle, in this splendid metaphor here. You must devour each other like spiders in a pot, seeing that there are not 50,000 good positions for you. Do you know how a man makes his way here? This is one of Balzac's signature statements. By the brilliance of genius or the cunning use of corruption. You must cut a path through this mass of men like a cannonball, or creep among them like a pestilence. I like those lines. Cannonball, of course, is the route that Vautrin himself has used and continues to use. He takes on society. He's the great countercultural figure of the novel. He is the enemy of the people, as Ibsen might have said. We're going to see that Rastignac may be drawn more to the pestilence model. And then one more quote that I'd like to give you from Vautrin, which is more philosophical in character. And it's really one of the great anti-idealist remarks of the novel. A man who boasts of never changing his opinions is a man who forces himself to move always in a straight line, a simpleton who believes he is infallible. There are no such things as principles. There are only events. There are no laws. There are only circumstances. This is prodigious. This is a view of life that simply erases from the blackboard all of those laws and ideals that have been drummed into this young man in his traditional education and by his own family. Vautrin is the figure who really articulates the most venomous view of society that Balzac has to offer. That's why I said that Balzac may believe that he is a great supporter of church and throne, but that all of the, not just venom, I think, but all of the energy and vigor of this novel comes out in these grand pronouncements by Vautrin. And as I said, they're almost statistical analyses. He tells him, here are the number of people that you're competing with, here are the number of slots that are available. Think what some of these people are, how low they're willing to go to get to these positions. And even if you succeed, you're going to be worn out, eaten up, devoured. What's worth it? Why do it when I'm giving you this alternative scheme here? All it will take is a few little moves on my part. You will be married to this woman who adores you, Victorine. You will be wealthy. You'll give a little bit of it to your buddy Vautrin, etc. That is the satanic move. That is the Mephistophelian move. That is the the compact with the devil that's being offered to the young student. That is the great moral challenge for him. Will he do it or not? And another way of saying that is, here's the choice between the two fathers. Here is the amoral, brilliant Vautrin. That's one kind of a father with this very cynical success schema, strategy, versus Goriot, who is the man crucified for love, not loved enough in return, who represents a different pole, as it were. Again, why does Vautrin do it? Remember that sign that I alluded to this is a boarding house for ladies and gentlemen, etc. And the etc. is Wuthering. There is a definite homosexual note in Wuthering. At one point, we learn later in the novel that his secret is that he doesn't particularly like women. But even before we learn that, when the student says, well, why are you doing this for me? He says, I'll tell you one of these days. I'll whisper a word in your ear. It's one of the kind of modern touches of this book about what's sort of under the surface of it. Well, Wuthering and Goriot are the two polar figures of fathers, it seems to me. Goriot is dying, as I have said, and the daughters continue to press right on his deathbed. They press him for more and more money to get out of the scrapes that they're in, to be able to pay off debts that they've got because of their lovers or because of other problems that they have had. And the old man is, I've used that expression, being bled dry. It almost has a medical meaning in this text. They don't come, the daughters. You remember Goriot's remark that you give them life, they give you death. They give you death. They don't come. The people who take care of the dying man in his garret room are precisely Rastignac and his friend, the medical student, Bianchon. I'll read you one passage that's not accented in this text. Eugène went down, that's Rastignac's first name, Eugène went down for dinner when Bianchon came upstairs again. During the night, they looked after the sick man in turn, one student spending the time reading his medical books, the other writing home to his mother and sisters. It's funny, it's not a line, as I said, that has any fanfare, and yet it's a sweet line. It's a line about domesticity. It's a line about one of them reading his medical books and the other writing home to his mother and sisters. It's a line about the traditional values. It's a line about family. And gradually it dawns on you that the boys, in particular Rastignac, but also Bianchon, as they deal with Goriot, as they talk to him, they call him Papa more and more and more. And you begin to realize that there's a different relationship here, that this too perhaps is a kind of fatherly relationship of sorts. The dying of Goriot takes pages and pages in this book. Balzac, as I said, he's very sort of medicinal. I mean, he's telling you about all the treatments they give him, the doctors who come in and try to tend to him, the agony that the man is in. The daughters won't come. Even though Rastignac is there, it turns out, this is the structure of this book, that there's also a very fancy ball being given at Madame de Beauseant's. It's not just fancy, it's a kind of dramatic event because it's an event where her own lover is not going to come. She doesn't know this. Everybody else in Paris knows it. He's not going to come because he's going to make a very wealthy marriage with a rich young woman, and he's going to therefore betray Madame de Beauseant. And people are going to go to her party in order to see how she deals with it. It says a lot about the sort of brutality and avid curiosity of this culture, about how people get their death blows and how that becomes entertainment. Well, Delphine has been invited to this big party because of Rastignac's connection with Madame de Beauseant. She's his cousin. And she is certainly not going to waste her time tending to her dying father when she has the opportunity to go to this grand event, which will sort of establish her in a different social echelon. Rastignac is sick at heart at this. He can't believe it. And he begins to have an almost architectural sense, and I'm using the word figuratively, architectural sense of the moral dimensions of his own world, that somehow going to this elegant ball where people are there to watch this woman be humiliated, and all he can think of is the squalor of this dying man in his garret room, deserted by his own daughters. And he begins to realize that all of these things sort of overlap each other. They're like planes that he now sees the connection between. It's almost a fourth dimensional vision, or a third dimensional vision to say the least. It's also a structural picture of the way Paris works. This is the education, that behind the glittering and the glamour of this elegant world, the beau monde, there are also the dying figures like Goriot, the squalor of this boarding house, he realizes that there's an integral vision here. These things somehow fit together. That's what he is learning. He's learning about the cost of this parvenir, success paradigm. It's a kind of tragic vision, a double vision. The dying Goriot is seen through the splendor of the Beauseant reception. This is the cost of things. And as the old man dies, the only two people tending him are Rastignac and Bianchon. And at a marvelous moment, as he is really in his death throes, he thinks that his daughters have come to visit him at last to say farewell, and he puts his hands on the two boys' shoulders and he says, "Mes anges, my angels." And the narrator says, folly once again, mistaken once again. He thought that these were his daughters and they were just the law student and the medical student. But what I want to say is that there's a great wisdom here, that they have become his figurative sons. And by that, what I'm trying to say is that even though overtly this novel is teaching us about the cashiered feelings in this kind of new economic order, about the death of feeling in this new world, it is also showing us through the very narrative dynamics of these two boys taking an interest in this man, it is showing us the creation of a new kind of family. And maybe that's what art is, to make us take an interest in other people that we would otherwise know nothing about. Maybe that is a familial paradigm, and maybe that's why the book is called Père Goriot. Thank you. As I talk about Wuthering Heights in this lecture, I'd like you to bear in mind what I said earlier about the Bildungsroman, the one that the form that we see so clearly in Balzac. Because the Bildungsroman, even when it's cynical, as it is in Balzac, or if it's tragic, I think is a reassuring form, because it means that somebody learns something. Rastignac does learn something. He learns what happened to Goriot. Education is possible. Society may finally be seen as evil, but it can be understood. But there could be other views of the world, darker, less amenable to sweet reason, more unhinging. And I think that's what Wuthering Heights is. Wuthering Heights was for me an important decision for this course, because one could have easily chosen Charlotte Bronte's book, Jane Eyre, which is, I think, a more recognized major novel of the 19th century. And Charlotte, the older sister to Emily, wrote a book about maturation. It really is a Bildungsroman. It's about accommodation. It's about Jane overcoming obstacles and moving ever more firmly and impressively into adulthood and selfhood. Emily, who died quite young, Emily's book, Wuthering Heights, is fierce. It's fiercer than anything else we're going to look at in this course. It depicts a world that is extraordinarily primitive, dark, unmanageable, and it can make, by contrast, much of what we've seen seem prim or superficial or not really delving under the surface. So that a lot of the operative terms that we use, and that people have always used, such as reason versus emotion, etc., they won't take us very far in this book, because reason doesn't have any purchase in this book. And emotion or passion is something that can't be corralled in this book. It seems to be the wellspring of being. It seems to be allied to the natural elements themselves. And this is a book about the natural elements. It seems to make a mockery of our notion of civilization, which comes across as something like a papier-mâché construct, a dollhouse, having little relationship to the actual organic, fierce, dark forces that roil both in the world and in the human subject. One grid that may help us make some sense of this book is a set of terms used by the anthropologist Levi-Strauss. He wrote a book called The Raw and the Cooked, and even though there's not much interest in food in Wuthering Heights, the raw and the cooked signify for the anthropologist a world of sort of unprocessed feelings and passions and emotions. Primitive world on the one hand. It can be used to describe perhaps some tribal cultures, or at least the origins of some tribal cultures. And then at the other end, as the very project of civilization, the cooked. In other words, what we take with raw ingredients that we have, let's go back to the culinary model, and we produce cuisine, we produce food. This is really the process, the project of civilization. That really might, in fact, help us to see what's happening in this book. As I said, education, you could claim, is moving from the raw to the cooked. Education means to get a handle on things, to be able to see how things fit or how they might be made to fit, to impose, if not to discover, some form of order. The title of this book, and the other place that's the contrast to the title, epitomizes these notions of raw versus cooked. Wuthering Heights is the kind of raw, primitive place in the moors where this story originates and I think arguably never truly leaves. And its opposite number would be Thrushcross Grange, the other dwelling place where the other family, the Lintons, the more refined family, lives. And so the dichotomy, the binary system is altogether set up. Fierce, primitive, and unschoolable Wuthering Heights, in the moors, a place where civilization perhaps cannot take root, cannot take hold, and then a place of order, refinement, leisure, beauty, culture, cultivation, learning, and that would be Thrushcross Grange. These are not bad terms, almost like a set of magnetic poles, and the current that goes between them is in some sense the driving sort of energy of this book. The solution that is going to be proposed, and I'll say it now because I'll deal with it later, but even then I won't deal with it too much because I'm not sure that it works. The solution that's going to be proposed for sort of resolving the conflict or the dichotomy or the incompatibility between the raw and the cooked, or between Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange, or between the actors of Wuthering Heights and the actors of Thrushcross Grange, is going to be a generational solution, that the children will maybe carry out the charge of culture through marriage, through softening, through understanding. And so that's sort of the gambit of the book. One of the interesting and I think unanticipated features of the book for most readers is the way that Emily has framed this. And I say it's unanticipated because Emily was fundamentally unschooled. Emily died very, very young. She was sick all her life. She was a fierce soul. In one of the prefaces written to the book by her sister Charlotte, one of the funny moments is when Charlotte more or less queries out loud, how on earth could Emily have known the things that she knows in this book? How could she have grasped the kind of grisly, grim, ferocious nature of these people when she seemed to know so little? She seemed to be bedbound and housebound. How is it possible that she knew? And it's a good question. I mean, of course, we don't know how Shakespeare knew what he knew either. So you don't anticipate that this unschooled girl, I mean, not unschooled, she had some education, some learning, but how this rather unsophisticated young woman would give us a rather sophisticated narrative structure. And in particular, what I'm alluding to is the use of several different narrators who were at some distance from the events that are going to be related in this book and recounted. The first narrator that we run into is the visitor Lockwood. Lockwood is a man who is a fool. He's an over-civilized, mannered fop. We immediately see that he's posturing, that he represents the kind of excess of refinement of civilization. His language seems to be that way. His thinking seems that way. He seems to be a rather shallow, brittle type, and he comes from London to rent Thrushcross Grange, which is well beyond the time that the events that are central have taken place. He meets Heathcliff. I'll talk a lot more about Heathcliff as I go. He's one of the central players. What I'm really trying to get at is that Lockwood is, from every point of view, as a Londoner, as an over-civilized fop, utterly sort of unqualified, incapable of understanding the story that's going to be related, that's going to be told. In other words, what kind of grasp would this man have of Wuthering Heights? And yet, he is going to be initiated into it, into its horrors, into its dark truths, and it will come through dream and hallucination. He spends the night in Wuthering Heights, and he has some strange dreams, and I want to quote you some of this. That he's lying in an oak closet, and he dreams, and he hears the wind and the snow, and he hears a fir bough sort of beating against the window, he thinks. And so this is still in the dream. He opens up the casement, he is trying to stop this noise that's keeping him, that's bothering him in the dreams, and he's knocking actually his knuckles through the glass in the dream. And as he reaches out in the dream, his fingers close upon the fingers of what he calls a little ice-cold hand. And you then know that you're sort of in funny territory of the Gothic here. And he tries to take his arm back in, but the hand, this little ice-cold hand, clings to it. And there's a voice that sobs, "Let me in, let me in." I mean, this is an unusual way to start a novel. It's like there's a ghost that's there that has to come in. We think of ghosts as having to get out. This ghost has to come in, and this ghost has to deliver itself of the story. I want to call this is like the ghost of narrative. This is like a ghost that cannot be naysayed. It reminds me of the Ancient Mariner, who has a story that must be delivered, must be told. And the voice says that its name is Catherine Linton, and we can't know at this point who that is. It's a lost child. Well, this is already fairly strong stuff, but watch the way this continues to go. As it spoke, I discerned obscurely a child's face looking through the window. Remember, he has knocked out the window pane. Terror made me cruel, and finding it useless to attempt shaking the creature off because it won't let go of his hand, I pulled its wrist onto the broken pane and rubbed it to and fro till the blood ran down and soaked the bedclothes. Still it wailed, "Let me in." To me, this is one of the most really stunning and sickening notations in literature. I mean, just think about it. I have trouble getting my head around all of that. To rub a child's wrist on a broken glass pane. To rub it. I mean, this is a moment of extraordinary cruelty and sadism. And this gesture is done by this quite civilized narrator, Lockwood. It's like automatically this book wants at the very beginning to show you, look what's underneath this proper surface. Maybe that's what dreams are about. Freud was going to theorize all of this later. Is it what is latent inside of us, what's repressed inside of us, what might be called the id or whatever term you want to use for it? This obviously manifests itself in dreams, but this dream has a lot of very specific qualities, and in particular, it's about the abuse of a child. This child that I've said is the ghost that wants in. It's the ghost of narrative in some sense. It gives a kind of ghoulish flavor to this novel. I mean, this is like an inversion of the invocation to the muse from ancient literature, that the writer asks, that the muse will come and somehow inspire him. And in this case, it's this dead child, or a child that cannot die, that's banished into being a ghost that continues to haunt. It is a haunting, and wants to come in. It's also a glimpse of the sadism, the substantial amount of sadism that is going to come. Because I'm going to be arguing that it's possible to see this entire novel as a story of abused children, of childhood as a time of abuse. Well, if Lockwood is one of the narrators. The other major narrator that we encounter early on is a woman named Nellie Dean. She is a shrewd woman of common stock who has served these families and has witnessed this story firsthand. So you would think, well, she's going to be a reliable narrator. She's someone who was there. And of course, that's what reliable narrator means. And of course, the term is used usually because we realize they're not so reliable after all. And in fact, if somebody was there, does that mean that they understood? Now, Nellie Dean is an interesting figure. She's not a fop like Lockwood. She is a remarkably low-to-the-ground, commonsensical, shrewd figure. And I say that to raise the question as to whether such a person, just like I raised it for Lockwood, is capable of understanding the events at Wuthering Heights, or the people at Wuthering Heights, or the things that they did at Wuthering Heights. And specifically, Nellie is going to be our conduit because she's the one who is going to tell most of the novel, the story. She knew these people. She's going to recount the story to Lockwood. That's how we get it. So that's why I said this is a pretty sophisticated framework for a novel written by someone who only wrote one novel. I think it's not unfair to say that Nellie gets a lot of things wrong in this book. Frequently, she will construe as posturing the activities or actions or gestures, desperate gestures of characters which are not posturing at all, which have a kind of gruesome sort of seriousness and unfakeness to them, if I can use that word. So it raises the question of whether this commonsensical figure could possibly take the measure of what she's telling. And I want you to think about how much interesting sort of energy and electricity is in that. Melville uses this model all the time. I'll refer to it a little bit in later lectures on Moby Dick, but in stories like Bartleby the Scrivener or Benito Cereno, it's the same thing. What an interesting formula to have someone tell a story that he or she doesn't fully understand, because the reader then negotiates between these positions. Some people have called this model also the seer-scribe model, that you've got a seer, someone who has these extraordinary visions, who is possessed of some demonic knowledge perhaps, and then you've got a scribe, some other person at some distance from this figure whose job it is to, in a sense, translate these findings and make them available to us. You could argue this is the mediation of literature itself. It is the bridge between us and events at which we were not present. And if you think about it, it's a very, very usable model. I think you could talk about a novel like The Great Gatsby that way, that Nick Carraway is our conduit to Gatsby. Or in one of Faulkner's great novels, Absalom, Absalom, Quentin and Shreve are our conduit to Sutpen. It's as if certain kinds, and we will see that Ishmael may be thought of in Moby Dick as a conduit to Ahab. So it's an interesting narrative formula, and again, that's what Brontë has come up with. Well, let's get to the story itself. Nellie's story revolves around the Earnshaw family's history of long ago, well before Lockwood arrived on the scene. Turns out that Mr. Earnshaw, the father of Hindley and Catherine, goes on a mysterious visit, without telling anybody why, to Liverpool and returns with an even more mysterious item, an orphan child, Heathcliff, whom he adopts into the family. It just happens like that. He says that he saw this child starving in the streets of Liverpool. Who is Heathcliff? People have been asking this question ever since this novel has been talked about. Some people have said, and my description might have already suggested it to you, that maybe this is Earnshaw's illegitimate son. I mean, after all, he goes off to Liverpool and he comes back with a little baby. But there are tons of references, not tons, but there are a number of references in the book about other sort of origins for Heathcliff. Maybe he could be a gypsy. He's called a Lascar. He's called black. He's called American. Nellie once calls him that you may be descended from exotic royalty. And some critics have said, well, actually, if you think about the English-Irish relationship, he represents the Irish. For me, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Nonetheless, he represents the other. And there too is a sophisticated narrative formula. Take this child who is totally different. He's called a dirty, ragged, black-haired child speaking gibberish. Take him and stick him into a family, and you've got a kind of ticking narrative bomb about what kind of results are going to come from this. Well, whatever his origins are, he is roundly despised by the older sibling, Hindley, but he forms a remarkable relationship with the feisty girl, Catherine. It's a kind of fusion of souls, it's a kind of kinship that seems to go beyond flesh. They play together all the time. They are inseparable, and you will see that I mean that word quite literally. They spend their days in the moors playing. They are wild children in some sense, children of nature. Now the plot moves along in this book at a moment when the two children sort of make an excursion over to Thrushcross Grange, where the Linton, the more refined Lintons, live. And this is when the nature-culture battle starts to move into higher gear. It turns out that Catherine is injured as they're spying on the Lintons, and she is taken in by the family because they are neighbors, they know each other, and Catherine comes from decent stock. She's an Earnshaw. The family thinks that Heathcliff is absolutely worth nothing. They even make a joke. They suggest that he should be hanged. A lot of brutality in this book. It's everywhere. But they do feel like they should take care of Catherine, and she stays there for 5 weeks as they sort of take care of this injury that she's had from a fall. When she returns home, she's a different girl. She returns home. The text says she's no longer the wild, hatless little savage, but now she's a very dignified person, and her older brother Hindley is quite delighted with the transformation. Of course, the person who's not so delighted is Heathcliff. Heathcliff has had nothing but contempt for these wimpish Lintons with all of their civilized manners. He and Catherine have had a kind of special relationship, a kind of wild relationship in the wilds, and so he feels that he has nothing to worry about from these others, but it turns out that the new Catherine who returns home, who's a bit of a little lady, she begins to give him a kind of class consciousness of his own possible inferiority. And he's got enormous pride, which is now injured from this sense. He thinks that their lives are artificial, the Lintons, but nonetheless he can see that Catherine herself is drawn to it, and drawn to it to the point that perhaps she's going to reject him. And of course the spice is added to that by the fact that the Linton boy child, Edgar, has already fallen in love with Catherine. And so this would be Heathcliff's antagonist. Well, all of this is going to have enormous repercussions, it will turn out. The catalyzing event in this book, and I'll spend the rest of the lecture talking about this event, and in a sense it's a fairly conventional thing, because I mean, novels are filled with moments where someone is listening at a door and overhears something, or somebody spies in a window and sees something, and you think to yourself, you know, life isn't like that. That's really not how we always learn about things. Books frequently rely on that kind of embarrassing way of getting information across, and this one does too. So sure enough, here are Catherine and Nellie Dean having a conversation, and Heathcliff is going to be hearing it. They don't know that he's there. He's in the other room. Catherine assumes that he's outside or somewhere else. He's not spying. He's not really trying to overhear it. It just so happens he's within range to hear it. And they're talking about dreams. Dreams play a large role in this novel. It's as if it says something about Emily Bronte's interest in not just the oniric, but the supernatural, the world that's beyond the kind of material, empirical, measurable world that we think of as reality. And that's why there is a kind of strong romantic dimension to this text. And she talks about heaven, and she shocks Nellie by saying that she would be miserable if she were in heaven. And I'm going to want to talk about that for a minute too. And of course, Nellie has a predictably, I think, moral reaction, which is, you're such a naughty little girl, and she is naughty. She's extremely feisty. She's hard to manage or control. The father is dead, so she's been more or less brought up by the older brother, Hindley, and she's not really being brought up at all, up until the visit to the Lintons, where she becomes more civilized. Up until then, she's really been a kind of native child in the wilds with Heathcliff. But she tells Nellie that if I were in heaven, she says, I wouldn't be happy there. And of course, as I said, Nellie says, well, that's because you're naughty. All sinners, Nellie says, every sinner would be unhappy in heaven. That's not it. She says, I had a dream. I had a dream once that I was there. Oh, this gets more interesting now. What kind of a dream was this? Nellie, again, commonsensical Nellie, I don't want to hear anything about dreams. Dreams aren't real. But of course, this is a novel. You're going to hear the dream. I was only going to say that heaven did not seem to be my home, and I broke my heart with weeping to come back to earth. And the angels were so angry that they flung me out into the middle of the heath on the top of Wuthering Heights, where I woke sobbing for joy. It's a marvelous reversal of what we think of as the kind of traditional dogma. We sob when we are kicked out of heaven, or kicked out of Eden, if you wish, because we have lost our place in paradise. On the contrary, heaven is a foreign, alien place. Heaven is not a place where you could be happy. She weeps for joy because she has been sent back to the heath, to the natural world, the world of elements, and of course also to Heathcliff. And Nellie is interested in whether Catherine is now drawn to this little boy, Edgar, who's so wild about her. And Catherine is no fool. She knows that. That will do, she says, to explain my secret as well as the other. I've no more business to marry Edgar Linton. He already wants to marry her. I've no more business to marry Edgar Linton than I have to be in heaven. And if the wicked man in there, she's talking about her older brother, Hindley, who is terribly abusive to Heathcliff. He likes his younger sister, Catherine, but he despises Heathcliff. He has despised him ever since the father brought him into the family. He treats him like dirt. There are a lot of vicious scenes between the two of them. And if the wicked man in there had not brought Heathcliff so low, I shouldn't have thought of it. It would degrade me, she says, to marry Heathcliff now. This is a key line. A child almost says that. And that's because Heathcliff is sort of, has no finesse, no poise, no style. He has none of the veneer of culture. He's sort of a ragged, sort of urchin child, even though he's allowed to live with the family. Hindley gives him nothing. And so that's what she means. It would degrade me to marry Heathcliff now. So he shall never know, Catherine continues, he shall never know how I love him. And that, not because he's handsome, Nellie, but because he's more myself than I am. And I want you to think about that line. I'm going to come back to it because there's another speech in a moment that has even more of that. Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same. And Linton's, that's Edgar's, is as different as a moonbeam from lightning or frost from fire. Emily Brontë just has an absolutely surefire gift, instinct, for invoking the natural elements to describe human feelings. Heaven is rejected here as a kind of pious, inhospitable artifact. But the heights, Wuthering Heights, raw nature, that's home, where Heathcliff is. It's a new kind of fierce Eden. It's a fierce view as well of human connection, because Heathcliff is more myself than I am, she says. I think this book is about reimagining paradise. And it also asks, doesn't say it directly, but it's implicit in everything I just read to you. What kind of heaven would there be if I was there by myself? Could that be heaven? Well, Heathcliff has overheard this, and here is the kind of gimmick, he has listened only to the point where she says, it would degrade me to marry Heathcliff now. This hurts his pride so much that on a dime he turns, he gets up, he leaves, and he leaves. He really leaves. He's not to come back. He doesn't hear the rest of the phrase where she says that she loves him more than herself. And so the plot of the novel is going to hinge on that it's a misconception. Well, he leaves, but she continues talking. And I want to read you the remainder of her words to Nellie. Nellie understands nothing, but you will. It's one of the greatest speeches in English literature. What were the use of my creation if I were entirely contained here? What she means is, what would it mean to be me if it was only me? Why would I have been born if I was contained only in myself? My great miseries, this is a girl speaking, a young girl, my great miseries in this world have been Heathcliff's miseries. And I watched and felt each from the beginning. My great thought in living is himself. If all else perished and he remained, I should still continue to be. And if all else remained and he were annihilated, the universe would turn to a mighty stranger. I should not seem a part of it. My love for Linton, because she is fond of Edgar. My love for Linton is like the foliage in the woods. Again, these natural images. Time will change it, I'm well aware, as winter changes the trees. My love for Heathcliff resembles the eternal rocks beneath, a source of little visible delight, but necessary. And then the great single, simple, elemental line, Nellie, I am Heathcliff. It's such a line. Nellie, I am Heathcliff. He's always, always in my mind, not as a pleasure, any more than I'm always a pleasure to myself, but as my own being. It's the grand utterance that she is Heathcliff, that the two of them are bonded. It's an umbilical picture of human beings in which individuation itself would be a mirage. The contours of I are erased here. The contours of a being that has edges are erased. It's like Siamese twins. Now you may think that this is a very romantic utterance, I am Heathcliff. We're going to see that this is a tragic utterance. And I want you to reflect on that. What does it mean to deeply believe, to know, in fact, that you are somebody else? It doesn't mean that you're not you, but it means that you are also somebody else. It is the end of agency. It's the end of hegemony. It's the end of any sense of self-ownership. It is a horrible kind of openness and vulnerability. And the remainder of the novel and my next lecture are going to deal with just those issues. Thank you. In this concluding lecture on Wuthering Heights, I'm going to steer us a little bit towards the dark side of things in order to further explain why I think it's sort of insufficient to term this text romantic, which is how most people regard it. It might be more accurate to say that this text is pathological. It's about mania. But to take it out of that medical discourse, perhaps one can say it's also about the poisonous consequences of both cruelty and love. Consequences that cruelty and love live on, that they don't stop when you think they do, when some of the actors themselves die. And in that sense, the story almost has a Greek feeling. It reminds me a little bit of the Oresteia of revenge, of cycles of revenge, because the figure of Heathcliff only makes sense to me in that sense. So, Catherine's grand pronouncement, I am Heathcliff, even if it seems to us the kind of romantic epitome of desire, it comes early in the book, and we don't really expect, as we're reading it, for things to go as badly as they're going to. The book obliges us increasingly to measure what it means to be somebody else as well as to be oneself. So plot-wise, once Heathcliff leaves because he has heard only a portion of Catherine's remarks to Nellie, thinks that Catherine looks down on him, he leaves, and she soon enough marries the very likable Edgar Linton, who was crazy about her, and she moves into Thrushcross Grange. A few years later, and this is classic sort of novelistic behavior, romantic logic, I suppose, Heathcliff returns out of nowhere. And he returns completely altered. He's handsome, he's rich, he's impressively endowed. He was a kid when he left. He exudes a sense of power and arrogance and authority. And, not surprisingly, he pronounces an implacable judgment on the events that have taken place since he's been gone. He indicts Edgar as an impossible match for Catherine, for someone of her vitality and generosity. He sort of refers to him as the slavering and shivering thing, says that you may have preferred to me. This is crazy. How could you have done this? He also, at one point, actually compares this marriage to as if it had, that someone had planted an oak in a flower pot and expected it to survive. In other words, Edgar can't possibly be the appropriate figure for Catherine. But what he says about Edgar is really small beer in comparison to the indictment, the really withering indictment that he gives to Catherine for what she has done. Because in betraying him, she's betrayed herself. And now we begin to see what the consequences are of I am Heathcliff. That none of your acts has the same autonomy that you always assume they have. That if I do this, I do this. I'll take my licks for if it's wrong. But it doesn't occur to most of us that we're acting for two people in this regard. And so Catherine, who is faced with the return of Heathcliff and his insistence on the wreckage that this marriage has wrought, can't bear it. And the book is really merciless. It's unsparing in its almost clinical account of the way these two go at each other, the way Heathcliff bears down on Catherine to tell her in great detail how unbearable it is and how criminal it is what she's done. And again, we think of most arguments as A telling B that what B has done is wrong because A thinks it is wrong. But none of that will wash in this book, because what Heathcliff is saying to her is that everything you have done has to do with us. And all of my own language is far too feeble here. And let me cite some of this and you get a better feeling for it. First of all, she is becoming ill. She cannot bear, because his very presence when he returns is a kind of unmistakable proof of how badly she has managed her life, what she has lost in giving up Heathcliff and in marrying Edgar. And when the two of them see each other, Heathcliff is banished from the property. Edgar can't bear to have him there. But he comes anyway. He can't be stopped. I think that's a general truth about Heathcliff. He can't be stopped. And this is the way Nellie tells it when the two see each other. Catherine made a spring, and he caught her, and they were locked in an embrace from which I thought my mistress would never be released alive. And a moment later, Nellie writes, he gnashed at me and foamed like a mad dog. It sounds like a rabid dog, doesn't it? And gathered her to him with greedy jealousy. I want you to hear the animalism here. This isn't psychology. This is something much more elemental and primitive than psychology. And that's what Nellie says. I did not feel as if I were in the company of a creature of my own species. It's as if you're leaving the human altogether. And it's after that that Heathcliff explodes into this indictment. Why did you betray your own heart, Cathy? I have not one word of comfort. And here she is dying. I mean, you would expect that this is when this man would treat her. He does love her, obviously. Treat her with kindness and gentleness. Well, forget it. There is no kindness and gentleness in this book. He says, I have not one word of comfort. You deserve this. You have killed yourself. And that, again, is part of the weird logic, the boomerang logic of this book. That what you do that you think is going out there is actually homing. It's coming in. It's being done to yourself. You loved me, then what right had you to leave me? Because misery and degradation and death and nothing that God or Satan could inflict would have parted us. You, of your own will, did it. I have not broken your heart. You have broken it. And again, the implacable logic. And in breaking it, you've broken mine. It's as if they share the same apparatus. is as if looking at these two people were a visual mirage. You see two people retinally, but that's not the truth of it. The moral and the affective and the spiritual truth of it is that it's one person in two bodies. Nellie, I am Heathcliff, is what she said. And we're beginning to see what that means. Catherine can't bear it. If I've done wrong, I'm dying for it. It is enough. You left me too, but I won't upbraid you. I forgive you. Forgive me. And this is like a deathbed request. And again, he's insistent. I forgive what you have done to me. I love my murderer, but yours? How can I? I mean, this thing is fabulously twisted, fabulously ingrown. It almost has a kind of mathematical horror to it. We are so accustomed to the I versus the world split. It's a kind of fiction that our skin convinces us of, that our craft makes its way throughout the world. It's ensconced in our body, our mind, our apparatus, and the rest of the world is, in some sense, at arm's length. And I don't think any human being escapes that feeling. It's not always a happy situation. This book annihilates that notion. This is a book where those contours are just simply blown to smithereens. It doesn't happen that way. These two people experience themselves as one, and therefore horribly vulnerable, interdependent. So that's really, I believe, the most kind of far-reaching, logic of this book, is that it ruptures our customary sense of things about where our contours stop, where our edges stop. Those edges are being erased here. Thus, it's perfectly appropriate that Heathcliff is going to essentially curse Catherine as she's dying. And I want you to hear this. Catherine Earnshaw, may you not rest as long as I'm living. You said I killed you. Haunt me, then. The murdered do haunt their murderers. Be with me always. This is right after she has died. He's speaking to the corpse. He even says, drive me mad. All of these are simply ways of instancing her, of proving that she is there, that she's inhabiting him, that she still lives. I cannot live without my life. I cannot live without my soul. You know, one hears of these horrible kinds of surgical crimes where someone is knocked on the head or whatever, and they wake up and someone has stolen one of their organs. You hear about this happening in some countries because organs are so vital. Sort of this passage makes me think of that. I cannot live without my soul. She's got his soul in hock. She has it, just as he has hers. Again, our sense of a kind of fundamental integrity of the body and of the person is just blown away here. This is also the kind of invocation for a haunting. I want you to haunt me, to torment me, because that's always further proof that our love is still real, that you are still there, that you're a living part of me. And I think this sends us back in some sense to the child ghost who haunted at the beginning of the book, Lockwood. And when Lockwood rubs that child's hand over the glass pane, that's the ghost that wants in. That ghost still lives. Our boundaries, including the boundary that we think death offers, those boundaries are eroded here. They're erased. So this installs a view of human experience and human sentiment that's different from what realist novels offer us. You won't find anything like this in Balzac. And it seems to me that Brontë also takes certain notions and pushes them further than we're accustomed. That the behavior of these characters is not only extreme, it seems pathological, it seems diseased, that we think that such things as self-control make sense. But these characters are among the most extreme in literature. And the book treats us to a number of scenes where we realize just how uncontrollable these people are, just how, I mean, we have that terrible phrase, people being a loose cannon, but that sort of artillery model, it seems to me, works here. And it tests as well the effectiveness of a narrator like Nellie Dean, who misconstrues these things. I mean, Catherine, when she's dying, is shrieking to Nellie. She speaks about 1,000 smiths' hammers, she says, that beat in her head. And she tries to tell Nellie, I'm going to explode. It's going crazy inside of me. And then she says things like, I'll break their hearts by breaking my own. I mean, that's one of the childlike remarks of this book. We've all seen children who threaten you in that way. But you can't distinguish here. You can't draw a line between the adult emotions of passion. I'm not sure where to put the sexual in this book. Some people have thought that this book is about incest. I can't quite see it. I'm not sure how libidinal this is or how somatic. I really believe it's spiritual. These two people are inseparable. They share each other. They can't not share each other. They can't get clear of each other. And they both want it to be that way because it's the most viable proof that they still live. Well, I think most of us, once we begin to see this part of the book, this dimension of this book, this sort of dark reach of the book, we begin to realize this is not going to end well. This is not going to do well. And so these characters, you begin to realize, I mean, today we have so many terms for this. We talk about certain kinds of psychoses, and we talk about certain kinds of mental disorders. I think Bronte's book can be very profitably read in those terms, that these are characters who are deranged. Heathcliff's return causes what we'd have to call a meltdown in Catherine. And before she dies, I mean, she does some pretty dreadful things. Edgar, as I said, wants to banish Heathcliff. He doesn't want this man near him at all. And Catherine locks the door when Heathcliff is there, locks the door so that Edgar cannot get rid of Heathcliff. Edgar has wanted to call his servants to upbraid or thrash Heathcliff. She locks the door and she says, okay, you want him out, you take him out. She doesn't use those words, but that's pretty much what, mano a mano is pretty much what she's saying. It's brutal, it's Darwinian. This book just simply discards our kind of polite cover for human relations and human arrangements. It takes it really right down to the elemental core, down to the bone, down to the nerve. At what point when, because this is something that I haven't yet told you, that Heathcliff is also kind of dashingly attractive, romantic figure for women, and in particular, Isabella, who is Edgar's sister, is utterly enamored of him. And this is something that Catherine can see, and she's not even bothered by it. She knows that she and Heathcliff are cut out of the same cloth, or of the same flesh and bone. She knows he can't be interested in Isabella, but she tries to tell Isabella. She says at one point, he's not a rough diamond, a pearl-containing oyster of a rustic. He is a fierce, pitiless, wolfish man. That's clairvoyant. That's lucid. He's a fierce, pitiless, wolfish man. These people see clear. They know what they're dealing with. They know that there's nothing soft and fuzzy about the romantic interactions in place here. Instead, they're death-dealing. They cannot be polished. They cannot be made. The raw can't turn into the cooked, put it that way. And so we get a feeling that this can't find a resolution. And of course, I think that's why she dies. His presence is too much. She's being invaded by tumult, being wrought up by these sort of unresolvable feelings and tensions. She moves towards collapse and she dies, and that's when Heathcliff invokes her dead body to haunt him. But if Catherine is mercurial, Heathcliff is volcanic. Heathcliff surpasses her in rage and fury in a way, not just Catherine, who's already quite a number on that front. He is almost immeasurable in his own violence, and people have related this to the Gothic genre, these sort of extreme, dark statements about human passion and violence and frenzy. But here's a characteristic one. I have no pity. This is after she's dead. This is what it means for her to haunt him, is that she nourishes his rage. She's like a succubus. She's inside of him. She's part of the venom that is life-sustaining for him. I have no pity. I have no pity. The more the worms writhe, the more I yearn to crush out their entrails. It is a moral teething. He has, by the way, married Isabella. Talk about trouble. He's married her. She's enamored of him. He's married her. He's going to treat her with utmost brutality. It is a moral teething, the way babies teethe. And I grind with greater energy in proportion to the increase of pain. Reminds me of that first passage about grinding that child's wrists over the broken glass. But Heathcliff takes it sort of as his standard, as his banner. This is how he will treat people. This is how he, in fact, treats Isabella. At one point, he remarks that he would like, if he were married to her, to have her face take on rainbow colors. And you may think, well, what a fanciful epithet that is. But he says something like, to turn her blue eyes black. And we have to realize he's saying that he is going to beat her so much that she will be black and blue. This behavior stamps him throughout his entire long life. Because Catherine dies very young, Heathcliff will live and preside over the next generation entirely. And when I say entirely, I mean despotically, tyrannically, and monstrously. And when I said there is no softness or gentleness in this book, it's most really frighteningly evident in the treatment of children. And that's a motif that you must have seen already in these lectures, that the child whose wrists, the ghost child whose wrists are brought over the broken glass, you just take a half step back and say, what an image of child abuse. And it seems to me that it tells us about what's going to come. Not just the sadism, but the sadism that is particularly directed towards children. And so Heathcliff is going to be awful to the children who come under his reign, under his control. And Cathy has a daughter from Linton, whose name is Catherine. Heathcliff beats her. We see it graphically in the text. He holds her head with one hand, and he administers a series of slaps with another. She asks for tenderness. She knows that he loved her mother, and he answers, I'd rather be hugged by a snake. He's incorrigible. That the dream of the tortured child, the dream that Lockwood had at the beginning, tells us what this book does. And I want to amplify that a little bit. It also tells us that childhood is a loss that can't be made good. And it tells us that we can look at the behavior of these characters. I've called them pathological. I've used words like mania. Well, let's use a child's word, tantrum. It's not, I think, implausible to regard the activities of Heathcliff and of Catherine as tantrums, as the kind of wild, erratic, irresponsible, uncontrollable behavior of people who can't grow up, who don't grow up. They remain the wild children on the moors. They can't grow up. They can't forget. They live through, of, by each other. And yet they are only the most visible, mad, angry, deranged people of this book. It would seem to be almost a trademark Heathcliff at one point talks about the way he treats Isabella. I've already told you that he's pretty rough on her. He can be quite abusive. Here's one of his remarks, and I want you to hear in this not only what he does to Isabella, but the kind of general tenor of things at the Grange. The Grange, of course, was the place of refinement when the Lintons lived there. Now that Heathcliff takes it over, and I'm going to say a word about that, taking over, it's under his dominion, and it's a different place. It's like Wuthering Heights. The first thing she saw me do on coming out of the Grange was to hang up her little dog. I can't tell you how many animals are murdered in this book. To hang up her little dog. That doesn't mean to pick up the little dog and put it somewhere. It means to hang it. And when she pleaded for it, the first words I uttered were a wish that I had the hanging of every being belonging to her, except one. Possibly she took that exception for herself. The book has a certain amount of irony in it as well. Heathcliff would like to hang every creature that Isabella is fond of. But no brutality disgusted her. I suppose she has an innate admiration of it. These lines give me pause. No brutality disgusted her. I suppose that she has an innate admiration of it. This is a text where we see so much violence, so much rage, so much anger, that the first thing we think of is, can people be this demented, this uncontrolled, this unable to restrain themselves? But the second thing that we want to think of, which is why I invoked the Oresteia and Greek tragedy, is that we see the repercussions of this. We see the impact of this. It's as if, and again, gentle Emily, who lived almost, bedridden, weak, dying, there was a fierceness in that young writer unlike anything that I know. That there is a sense in which she feels and knows that once you cut underneath the veneer of polished behavior and refinement and logic and rationality, and let's go further, decency, kindness, what you find is pure darkness. You find pure violence, vehemence. I mean, sometimes this reminds me of a theorist like Artaud, who talked about cruelty as the sort of bottom level of the human being, the basic level, the elemental level of human nature. This book gives, and it's in that sense that when you read a novel like Jane Eyre by Emily's sister Charlotte, you realize how proper it is. I mean, certainly Mr. Rochester is a kind of cousin of Heathcliff's, but Heathcliff makes Rochester look like a kind of polite gentleman. And he is a polite gentleman, but not so Heathcliff. You can't make a gentleman out of Heathcliff. He's a fiend. It's a word that's used many times in the book. That there's a kind of violence that just simply cannot be overcome. And the remark about Isabella, possibly she took that exception for herself, but no brutality disgusted her. I suppose she has an innate admiration for it. It's a chilling line. It's about the afterlife of cruelty. It's about cruelty as being infectious, contagious. We don't know that Isabella is like that. Most of the depiction of Isabella in the book is not like that, but still, Heathcliff's line gets to me. It suggests that we can infect people with our rage and anger and brutality. We see scenes of Hindley hanging dogs, Hindley being the older brother of Catherine. We also see the son, Hareton, Hindley's son, killing animals, brutalizing children. It would appear to be virtually the kind of signature behavior in this particular book. And I've stressed all of this, I've emphasized it all, to tell you how difficult it's going to be to clean this up. And that's what the aim of the generational structure of the book is. The first half of the book, by far the best half in my opinion, the first half of the book is the story fundamentally of Heathcliff and Catherine. it's the story of this remarkable demonic love between these two people, or between this one person who happens to be two. The second half of the book is where I think it falls off in intensity. It's arguable that no writer could maintain the intensity of the first half. And the second half of the book follows the affairs of the next generation, of the three children, because Catherine herself, the girl Catherine, is married off to Linton. That's the son that Heathcliff has with Isabella, sickly child, certainly not like Heathcliff. Heathcliff is brutal to him too. And Linton dies. Linton is a vicious little boy, by the way. And he dies. And then it turns out that the only male child left, young man, is Hareton, who is the son of Hindley. This is really kind of twisted, quasi-incestuous book along those lines. How many different ways the same people can be brought together in marriage. And it closes with our very clear vision that Catherine is going to marry Hareton, and that maybe this will be the way of somehow civilizing the brutal elements of the story. And of course, what does she do with Hareton? And this is classic, an anthropologist couldn't have written it better. She teaches him how to read. It's the very index of turning the raw into the cooked. From my personal taste, it's a bit sappy to watch the antics of the children once you have seen the kind of deadly, fierce, awesome, really magnetic behavior of the adults. Heathcliff lives a long life. He has managed to take on all of the estates. He's the master both of Wuthering Heights and of Thrushcross Grange, because he married Isabella. And there, people have read this book along economic terms, that this is a book really about a man garnering great economic power to himself. I don't know how far that goes. I mean, it's true, but I don't know if it'll take us deep enough into the book. As I said, the book is sugared over by the end. We see the next generation cleaning up most of the mess made by the first generation, and yet the last words of this book are Nellie's words. She's been telling the story to Lockwood, and she's looking at the moths on the heath, and she's listening to the wind. These are the elements. And she wonders, I quote, how anyone could ever imagine unquiet slumbers for the sleepers in that quiet earth. And we know that Heathcliff has arranged to be buried next to Catherine's coffin, and one senses that they are, in fact, not asleep. These are unquiet slumbers, even if the earth is quiet. Thank you. Welcome, folks, to Moby Dick. To try to do justice to this gargantuan book, it is the 800-pound gorilla in the American canon, in 2 lectures is going to be probably impossible. But one thing I can say is that you will notice that we are moving from the kind of organized frames, in particular the sort of thing we saw with the Bildungsroman, or the novel in general as we know it is a story of an individual against a social backdrop, into something quite different. We could call it from the Bildungsroman into the deep sea. Moby Dick essentially explodes what most people think a novel should be, and it's not clear that a novel is the right term to use for it. I love the book. There are people who can't bear it. It's not clear that it has a whole lot of women readers. There's certainly no women in the book, and I'll talk about that. But I think it's the most generous book in American literature, and that's because I think Melville has the most generous, robust imagination among American writers. It seeks to measure the immeasurable, which of course can't be done, but it can be attempted. It has a kind of eloquence. It has metaphysics, which is not something we've seen a lot of. We saw some of it in Wuthering Heights, but not so much in the other novels, and not so much in general in novels. Social notation is quite a different thing from metaphysics. It has also humor, which I think people need to discover and enjoy to realize that Moby Dick is not such a heavy read. And it has chutzpah, more than any book I know. So if it's no longer self versus society, which is the traditional sort of gambit of the novel, It's this time man, or to put it in more general terms, the human being in the universe. So Moby Dick is the American text that enters this course, and I'd argue that Moby Dick is the American text that enters world literature too, that establishes itself in world literature while challenging a lot of the canons about what literature is supposed to be. We'll see more of this kind of thing when we do Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, writers who challenge again the kind of more narrow, staid precincts of what a fiction would be and bring in metaphysics or lyricism or philosophy. There is a kind of marked, tragic curve to Melville's art. He became a remarkably popular writer, writing this bestseller, Typee, in the early 1840s, about his own adventures in the South Seas, about his sort of skirmishes with cannibalism. And this immediately sort of gained him a reputation, essentially as the man who lived among cannibals. And each book that he writes after Typee becomes less picturesque, less exotic, and more philosophical. And then in Moby Dick, which we think of as his masterpiece in 1851, it is the kind of fullest expression of all that Melville is ever to do. It has still some of the adventure elements of the tall tales of the earlier books. It has a huge dosage of the philosophy and the metaphysics that are coming into those books. And it was thought to be more or less unreadable. It sank him, to use a nice maritime metaphor. It sank him, it lost him his readership, and yet one of the ironies, of course, of history, one of the sweet things about history, didn't do Melville any good, is that we keep him alive, at least in some sense, by finding this book so fascinating and so valuable today, many, many, many years later, more than a century and a half. Because after Moby Dick, Melville begins to go downhill. He continues to write short stories, some of which are brilliant, in the 1850s. And then after the 1850s, he continues to live, but he becomes more or less a ghost, sort of disappears from the literary scene, and sort of pops up again in the late years of the 19th century with Billy Budd, which is a very sort of well-known late Melvillian autumnal story. Well, what explains this curve? I mean, why does a guy go from an extraordinarily popular, successful writer of adventure yarns to a dead weight, to a ghost? Let me talk about some of the things that are in Melville and that are at their fullest and at their richest in Moby Dick. Melville is responding to the legacy of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who is really the great architect, it seems to me, of American literature and American thinking in the early 19th century. Emerson's essays started appearing from the 1830s on. And in particular, Emerson calls for a new indigenous American literature. And it's hard for us, with our distance from this period, to realize what a bold call that was. But you have to realize that there was no such thing as American literature per se in the 1830s. The literature that was written in English was English literature. That American literature didn't really have its own stamp in the same way. There had been a few writers like Washington Irving, Benjamin Franklin, but Emerson wants a literature that really is through and through an indigenous form of expression. And also Emerson has I think what one has to call a kind of religious dimension to his thinking. It's philosophical, but it's also religious. He believes that the material world, the world of nature, the world of things, is saturated with spirit, with soul. He coined the word oversoul. And he thought that artists, in a sense, tap into that writers and poets tap into that soul which is in but also exceeds any of the individual items where we might find it. And you could argue that the act of reading is, in a sense, a kind of communion with this oversoul. I think that there's that same feeling in Melville, that it's not a reaction against materialism, but it's a view that the material world, the phenomenal world of surfaces that we all see, the empirical world, is suffused with something beyond matter, with spirit, with energy, not necessarily with God, but with something that you want to also bring to expression in your writing. Further, there is a political component in Emerson's work, which is to celebrate American democracy as a new social and political form. And heaven knows that is a kind of message, and I would argue a kind of myth, that we continue to believe in today, that we continue to celebrate today, and it's a reason why people still want to come to the shores of this country. Obviously, there have been many debates back and forth on that as to whether it is a myth or whether it's a dream, or whether it's been degraded or not. But nonetheless, there is a powerful democratic element in Melville. He's not quite a chauvinist, but he's not all that far from it. So Moby Dick appears in 1851, and people have called the 1850s in American literature the Renaissance. There's, in fact, a well-known book by F.O. Matheson called American Renaissance, because it's sort of astonishing to realize that The Scarlet Letter and Moby Dick and Walden and The Leaves of Grass by Whitman were all written within a 5-year period. It's as if there's a kind of explosion on the literary scene, because they all, in a sense, are the new kind of literature, particularly, I think, Thoreau, Whitman, and Melville. Hawthorne's a slightly different case. So here is a text that is a kind of indigenous American text. It wants to get clear, as Emerson urged, it wants to get clear of the European and classical standards by which literature was earlier produced. That in itself, you have to realize, is a sort of unusual thing. In the 18th century and earlier, the idea of being an original writer would not have made any sense. In fact, it would have been a criticism. You were supposed to follow the rules, follow the prototypes, to show that you understood the tradition. In Melville's case, you've got something so new that it was, in fact, more or less unreadable. Now, he didn't write Moby Dick simply because he had read Emerson. There were two other even more crucial encounters that actually happened around 1850. One of them is that he, rather late in his life, discovers Shakespeare at this time. And that's almost an immeasurable encounter, because Shakespeare gives him a kind of extraordinarily sublime oratorical register, which is almost incompatible with what we think of as fiction. I mean, if you look at Balzac, you're not going to find anything like that. Emily Brontë has a little bit of it, a kind of rich, full, figurative, metaphorical discourse that easily yokes together the ridiculous and the sublime, and that is absolutely sort of filling up Moby Dick, and particularly in the character of Ahab, this enormously vital, almost no-holds-barred, overflowing kind of writing. At the same time, we're going to see that Moby Dick has a very powerful vernacular punch to it. It's a robust book. So one encounter is Shakespeare. There are soliloquies in Moby Dick. You don't find soliloquies in the novel, but there are in Moby Dick because there are in Shakespeare. And the other person that he meets is a living person, not a dead writer, and that's Nathaniel Hawthorne. He reads Hawthorne's work in 1850, and he gets to know Hawthorne as his neighbor in 1851 in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. He is obsessed with Hawthorne's work. He finds that Hawthorne is a great example of a kind of integral American writing. When I say integral, a writing that has integrity in the sense that it rejects the marketplace. It's a writing that is true to spirit and to soul. It's written by a writer who himself is aloof, a writer who is pursuing his own particular gambit, dancing to his own tune. And the enthusiasm that Melville felt for Hawthorne is on show in one of the reviews he wrote for Hawthorne's work, but also in the letters that really are impassioned, almost embarrassing letters that he wrote to Hawthorne, because Hawthorne was a very shy and I think protective kind of figure who really could not reciprocate Melville's feelings. And so that it's a kind of one-sided friendship, but that's okay, because it was a productive friendship anyway for Melville. It helped, I think, to sort of generate this extraordinary novel that we call Moby Dick. Now, Moby Dick, let's talk about it more in particular now. It celebrates American themes in a way that no novel earlier really had. For example, instead of having kings and queens and princes, the kind of figures that you would find in classical literature as heroes, the hero that's presented, at least one of the heroes that's presented in this book, is the Nantucketeer. Now, who in the world, outside of somebody living in Massachusetts, would have thought that there could be such a thing as a Nantucketeer? Well, these are the fellows from Nantucket who are whalers, who go on the whaling boats and the whaling missions. And Melville wants to get it across that these people are as important, have as much stature as the kings and queens of old. That they are creatures of the sea themselves, not just like the whale. They're creatures of the sea who live there for years, make the sea their home. At one lovely passage, Melville writes that they sleep, the Nantucketeer sleeps, while under his pillow, and now I quote, rush herds of walruses and whales. America's promise, as I said, then and now, from a kind of political or ideological point of view, is democracy. And this is a book that tries to be democratic. It's a book where rank and class and hierarchy no longer matter, at least in the traditional sense. So that on this boat, the whaling boat, the Pequod, you now have sailors from all over the world of different colors, different stripes, living together on this boat. Now, I don't want to overstate this. It's democratic in the sense that it's kind of a rainbow boat. On the other hand, let's not forget, a boat is an extraordinarily vertical proposition. It's a hierarchical proposition, and it has a captain who rules over it. It has first mate, second mate, third mate, etc. So there's no question that it is not entirely kind of egalitarian setup. Another point that Melville does not make, but that readers since have made, is that it so happens that there are no women on this boat. And you could argue, well, what kind of broad swath could you have for a kind of writing about the American sort of people if you have no women on your boat? I'm going to digress for just a moment. Wonderful comment made by the great American literary critic Leslie Fiedler, who once said that all of the great American novels belong on the children's shelf. He said, only in American literature will your classics be books where there are no women, where two guys go out on a raft. He's thinking of Huckleberry Finn. And he says there's not one major American text that can even speak intelligently or dares to speak intelligently about sex between men and women. And so it's a provocative remark. You know, you've got Walden. Some guy goes into, a cabin that he makes and lives there. That it's as if adult love seems to be off limits for the American imagination. Well, that's something I'm not going to resolve that one because it's irresolvable. But I want you to think about it just a little bit when we trot out the notion that Moby Dick is a sort of democratic full book, which I believe. There's still a lot that's not in it. Well, we don't start with Ahab, who is the kind of larger-than-life captain of this book. We start instead with Ishmael, who was the novel's great narrator. I call him great because I think he's a real triumph. He's feisty, he's got a kind of remarkable voice, and he's the one who takes us from beginning to end. He's the one who survives the wreck of the Pequod and who lives to tell the tale. He's jaunty, he's lively, he's engaging, he's plain-speaking, he's bluff, but he's also a bit more complex than that. I think it's fair to say that he's also prone to depression. He's the one who says it. He once says early in the book that when he finds himself pausing in front of coffin warehouses or finds that he's joining funeral processions, he realizes it's time to go to sea. And you get the sense that there's a kind of therapeutic dimension to this book, that he's out there to solve his own problems as much as to be the conduit for this larger story. One of the most endearing early scenes in Moby Dick is when Ishmael first meets Queequeg. Queequeg is going to be the harpooner, one of the harpooners on the boat, but it's a friendship that is going to be very important. How it begins, however, is a series of comic errors. Ishmael has gotten his room in Nantucket, that's where they meet, quite late, and is told that he'll have to share a bed with someone. This apparently is not bizarre at this moment in time. But he has no idea who it is, and he certainly doesn't know that it's going to be this rather strange, exotic South Sea Islander, a man who also happens to be filled with tattoo marks and essentially a kind of figure that Ishmael has never seen before. So there's Ishmael lying in bed, it's late at night, and all of a sudden into the room comes this man who has no idea that Ishmael is lying in that bed. He comes in with a tomahawk and a wooden idol, and he's making these strange guttural noises, and Ishmael is understandably terrified, thinks that he's getting ready to be murdered. And so he screams, and Queequeg is making these noises, "Who devil you?" He screams, and the landlord comes into the room and tells him not to worry, it's only Queequeg, he wouldn't harm a hair on your head. At that point, Ishmael takes a closer look, and he sees that this is, in fact, a rather comely savage underneath these fierce markings. Melville writes quite wonderfully about that. This is Ishmael's sort of dawning perception that things are not so bad. Better sleep with a sober cannibal than a drunken Christian. Better sleep with a sober cannibal than a drunken Christian. A lot of Melvillian malice and wit is in that phrase, it seems to me. Here we see a white sailor sharing a bed with a dark-skinned man. And in fact, when they wake up, we learn from Melville's language, you had almost thought I had been his wife. We today would regard this encounter as multiculturalism, people from different races not only understanding each other, but experiencing a kind of intimacy. And it speaks for, in fact, the growing relationship that will take place in the novel. The connection between Ishmael and Queequeg is one that lasts throughout the book, and I think it leads into the larger theme of connection itself. One of the chapters, which is called Monkey Ropes, describes the complex set of ropes that hold seamen as they descend into the bodies of these enormous whales that are suspended, and they go into the bodies of these whales to excavate. But they're held by ropes, and there are usually two of them. One is holding the other who is down there, and Ishmael and Queequeg are connected that way. Melville actually uses the language of Siamese twins. And then he begins to think about this. And I'm evoking the scene because it's absolutely emblematic for the way Melville writes, for the way this man's mind works. We're starting with an extremely finite scene here. One man sort of tied by a rope to another who is descending into the body of this whale. It does sound exotic, but yet it's a very practical scene in terms of how the boat works. But it's not going to only be practical for Melville, because Ishmael realizes that this kind of bondage, this kind of connection, has extraordinary repercussions, ramifications. As he thinks about it further and further, this kind of, he calls it a Siamese ligature that unites them. He thinks of Queequeg as his twin brother. And then he uses a larger term, a joint stock company of two. He says that's what my individuality had now become, a joint stock company of two. And then he still, in Melville, once this thinking starts, once these gears start to turn, nothing can stop it. It keeps going. And so he begins to think about the relevance, the extraordinarily wide-ranging relevance of this perception for all of us. Not just folks on a whaling ship where one is holding another going down into a whale, but for all of us. And I'll just give you one of the most choice examples of it. If your banker breaks, you snap. If your apothecary by mistake sends you poison in your pills, you die. And what he's saying is, in every walk of life, in everything we do, we are interdependent, interconnected in ways that we rarely see. And it's important to bear this in mind, that there is almost a kind of ecological vision in this book, that we are all part of a kind of field picture, and that our own agency, hegemony, our own individual maneuvering room is always curtailed, always conditioned. It turns out that we're linked in ways that we rarely can measure. And the rich, expansive quality of Melville's imagination is to take these kinds of homely scenes, like monkey ropes, and to turn them into a metaphor that's really quite philosophical in character. Another one of those moments will be when he talks about fish. He talks about fast fish and loose fish. Fast fish, fast doesn't mean speed here, it means fish that belong to an owner. And loose fish would be fish that are fair game. These are terms that fishermen and whalers need to know about. Once again, Melville is going to operate his own kind of magic on these terms and think about what their repercussions are, what their fuller dimensions might be. And so it goes a little bit like this. What are the sinews and souls of Russian serfs and Republican slaves but fast fish? In other words, if you're a serf or a slave, you're a fast fish. Somebody else owns you. What to the rapacious landlord is the widow's last mite, but a fast fish? So now he's getting at the economic system itself, that the landlord controls, owns the poor widow. What is the Archbishop of Save Souls' income of £100,000 seized from the scant bread and cheese of hundreds of thousands of broken-backed laborers? What is that globular 100,000 but a fast fish? You begin to see the reach of this figure. What about loose fish? What was America in 1492 but a loose fish? At least that's what Columbus made it for. What was Poland to the Tsar? What Greece to the Turk? What India to England? He's talking about colonialism. He's talking about possession. He's talking about politics. What at last will Mexico be to the United States? All loose fish. Well, why stop with that? What all men's minds and opinions but loose fish? What are you, reader, but a loose fish and a fast fish too? And what's this lecture that I'm giving? It's a fast fish from my point of view, because I own it. I hope it becomes a loose fish, that you might take it, walk away with it, do something with it. That's the kind of ever-expanding Melvillian imagination. It takes things, and then it takes them, then it takes them, then it takes them still further, moving further and further outward in concentric circles, making us realize how lazy our minds are, how narrow our apprehension of things is. When I said he's generous, and when I said he's robust, that's what I had in mind. There's a kind of, I don't even want to say intellectual, there's a kind of almost spiritual, philosophical muscularity in Melville. The things that we know move further and further out towards things we don't know. The original title of this book is called Moby Dick or the Whale. And I've always said when I talk about this book that whales do not strike me as particularly exciting or meaningful animals to talk about. I mean, I know they're great big, kids like to see them and everything, but I can't see them as somehow provocative. Well, they are certainly for Melville. And one reason that they were for Melville is that petroleum itself was only discovered in 1859, 8 years after this book was written, so that therefore whale oil had an enormous economic significance for American society, and particularly the industrial society. And America was the unquestioned world leader in this field, and Melville's very proud about that. He wants to beat his breast and say, look, we Americans are leading the world in that. There were 700, this is Melville's data, I have not checked him. He claims there were 700 American whaling vessels out there. It was the world's largest fleet. It was worth $20 million, Melville's figures. It brought in annually $7 million in income, Melville's numbers. Well, this book, there's a term that we call cetology, which is the science of whales. In this book, if you don't like whales, you're not going to like Moby Dick. And let's put that differently. If you're not willing to think about liking whales, you're not going to like Moby Dick, because the book's going to try to persuade you that whales are about the most fascinating creatures in the world. This book gives you more knowledge than you could ever have imagined, than you would probably ever want about whales. Much of it is anatomical. We get lots of descriptions, many weights and measures about the huge scale of whales, but we also get close-grained descriptions as well. That Ishmael is awed by the whale's body, and he's awed. He tries to describe the whale's tail. And of course, being Melville, this comes into something much more suggestive and enigmatic, like a sign system. The strange design of this tail seems to perhaps represent, symbolize something else. And if we can understand perhaps the tail, could we possibly ever understand the whale's face? And you begin to realize you're dealing with a very old notion, like looking at the face of God, that the face of this whale, you can't take its measure. If the whale's physical sort of mass and bulk defy our measures, its background is richer still. Its history. It has a pedigree in both myth and legend. Melville tells us that the old stories we know about St. George, like St. George and the dragon, or Perseus or Hercules, where they're all fighting with dragons, he said, oh, no, those weren't dragons. If we think about it, they were probably whales, huge creatures, larger-than-life creatures. And he tries to make a case that whales were already there, inserted in myths that we think we know. Might the whale be the Sphinx of the sea? Melville cites Job, he cites Alfred the Great, he cites Edmund Burke, the British historian. He goes on to the gods and to the legends. He talks about Jonah, he talks about Hindu mythology. In all of these places, he can find whales. He's obsessed, Melville is, with the metaphorical reach and scale of whales, the way in which they configure the Godhead, but also, and this is perhaps more interesting to us, they figure the dimensions of yearning and belief. They are inhabitants of the depths. They offer, in fact, for Melville, an image of the human soul, unplumbable, living in the deep, having secrets that we want to know. And they suggest, therefore, which is what the whole book is suggesting, the arduous but exciting trip necessary to get there, to reach it, to sound it, to take its measure. Those are the adventures of this book. Ishmael seeks to date the whale's history, and he gives us some remarkable lines. He says that you can't do this because the whale is older than history. It precedes time. It precedes human beings when we started marking time. I quote, I am horror-struck at this anti-Mosaic, unsourced existence of the unspeakable terrors of the whale, which having been before all time, must needs exist after all human ages are over. It's a line that has a kind of unintended irony for us. We know that whales are almost endangered species, and yet Melville makes this marvelous sort of prophecy. They pre-existed humans, they will outlive humans as well. But he also talks about the whale in terms of him being a kind of occupant of the vast reaches of the world. They are creatures of the depths of thinking and of feeling, not just of the ocean, and therefore they have a kind of grandeur to them. And Melville's prose rises to the challenge. Listen to this. He, this being the whale, he swam the seas before the continents broke water. He once swam over the site of the Tuileries, the great gardens in Paris, and Windsor Castle, and the Kremlin. In Noah's flood, he despised Noah's ark. So here is this godlike creature whose dominion seems to be the entire world because there's far more water than land, and he is the great ruler. It's clear enough that the depths are going to be the area that fascinates Melville. And one of the notions that comes across in this book is the analogy between the depths of the sea and the depths of the soul, and then depths that are, in a sense, more everyday, which are the depths of human thinking. All deep, earnest thinking is but the intrepid effort of the soul to keep the open independence of her sea. That stamps, it seems to me, the flavor and character of this book. The sea represents depths. It represents everything that is beyond the surface world that we think confines us, that we think constitutes our knowledge. Whether it's the surface of our skin, which doesn't allow us to see the soul that lives inside of the human being, whether it's the surface of the physical world, like the surface of the ocean. He wants to go down. This is a book about plumbing. Plumbing not in the sense of, pipes, but plumbing in the sense of sounding the depths, going deeper and deeper. And this is larded, I think, with a certain kind of anxiety as well. To go into the depths, as all of us know, is not necessarily a fun trip. You may discover things that you do not like. It may not be easy to get there. And there is, in Melville as well, a kind of deep, I think never satisfied, yearning for something that might be at the bottom, or something that might be in this great ocean, but could be a place of peace and harmony and serenity. This is how he says that. For as this appalling ocean surrounds the verdant land, so in the soul of man there lies one insular Tahiti, full of peace and joy, but encompassed by all the horrors of the half-known life. It's this insular Tahiti that one wants to reach, but you don't reach it unless you have ventured into the depths, have entered into the ocean. A last sort of adjective for Melville that I'd like to give you is, amid the tornadoed Atlantic of my being. What a remarkable self-description. The tornadoed Atlantic of my being. He knows about the chaos, the distress, the restlessness, the curiosity, the blues, the depression that are part of his mindset and his soul set, and that he calls the tornadoed Atlantic of his being. And the quest is to acknowledge that and go through that to find either this insular Tahiti or to find some kind of what he calls eternal mildness of joy. We'll see how that works out in the next lecture. Moby Dick is not exactly a figure of joy. Thank you. Well, it's not going to be easily possible to wrap up in this second lecture all of my thoughts about Moby Dick. But one thing I can say is that we're going to move from measuring the whale to measuring Ahab. Because Ahab is in fact modeled after the whale. It's the larger-than-life hero of this text. He represents, I think, a kind of swollen, deified notion of the self But what is remarkable is that the book is much more than Ahab. He's been inserted in a text that is equally interested in subjectivity and perspective and multiple perspectives and multiple vistas. And this, in a sense, is a collision course between the monomaniacal single viewpoint of obsession on the one hand and a world that has much more scope and diversity to it on the other. Now, the Nantucketeer, as I said in my first lecture on Moby Dick, is presented by Melville as a new kind, rough-hewn, modest, but nonetheless impressive American hero. And Ishmael is also, in a sense, drawn to human scale, but this is not true for Ahab. He is as huge and dimensional as the whale. Actually, Melville's terms are quite wonderful. An ungodly but godlike figure. And his thoughts and his feelings, and in fact his soliloquies, constitute much of what is most dramatic and sort of spellbindingly eloquent about this book. Frequently he's imaged in terms of sultanism, a term that Melville took from the Middle East, from Arab culture, to signal something of this man's reach, because even to make an American shipping captain, a whaling captain, a hero equivalent to a king or a prince or a knight is already a fairly important step on Melville's part. He has, as I suggested earlier, in his position as captain of the ship, a kind of remarkable godlike power. And Melville was fascinated with this. As I said, on the one hand, this sort of tweaks our notion of whether this could be very democratic or not. Ships are not democratic places. But beyond that, Melville's fascination extends into the kind of moral and legal questions that go with this. If you've read if you've read Billy Budd, you know at the end of his career, Melville came back to this. What happens in a case where a man is going to be convicted of something and the captain knows that ultimately this man is innocent, but he nonetheless broke the rules? And we've got this kind of dilemma of what the captain of a ship is free or not free to do. And in a resplendent Melvillian story, Benito Cereno, we get another kind of inquiry, a kind of really rotating perspective on what it means to be the captain of a ship. So that mattered to Melville. He was very fascinated with the kind of responsibilities, but also perhaps the kind of blind spots that go with being captain. He is the one, of course, who was the candidate for the great Shakespearean soliloquies and for the grand language. You can't miss it. If you open up the book on any page and you get this language that is almost out of this world, it's so gorgeous and rich and sumptuous, you can pretty much assume it's Ahab who's thinking. He, of course, is on a revenge mission. He has lost his leg to Moby Dick, the great white whale. He obviously walks around on an artificial leg. He has been hit at the groin. They're unmistakable echoes of castration that are in this text. And he, therefore, sees in the white whale the very incarnation of evil. And his goal, as he says, is to strike through the mask. This is the revenge scenario. And he suggests, therefore, that this white whale is the incarnation of a spirit that is not just the whale, the spirit of evil that needs to be fought against. This is a problematic sort of position. His first mate, Starbuck, who was a Christian, believes that there is something deeply sinful about regarding this innocent creature as the embodiment of evil. But this is the way Ahab responds to him. All visible objects, man, are but as pasteboard masks. If man will strike through the mask. In other words, the world is just a series of signboards. And what you need to do to exert your own authority is to strike through. It's a very violent kind of model. How can the prisoner reach outside except by thrusting through the wall? It's as if we inhabit a kind of world of thin papier-mâché walls. And if we want to deal with the real forces that course through the world and inform our lives, we have to go through these walls. And he is aware that perhaps the white whale is that wall, and perhaps the white whale is not. Perhaps the white whale represents evil. Perhaps there's nothing behind the whale. It doesn't make any difference, he says. He tasks me. He heaps me, he writes. And he says that inscrutable thing is chiefly what I hate. And be the white whale agent or be the white whale principal, I will wreak that hate upon him. I'd strike the sun if it insulted me. What a line. I'd strike the sun if it insulted me. Here is the kind of overweening pride. Shakespeare even doesn't have characters who would quite say something like that, of this man's unbelievable arrogance. But also, I think it's a measure of his injury, of how much needs to be redressed in his mind. At one point, Ishmael begins to meditate about this and realizes the extent to which this whale is, in a sense, the kind of focusing fact of Ahab's life. That it's a weird kind of affective economy, that everything, because of the whale, comes together. I'll quote this too. All evil to crazy Ahab were visibly personified and made practically assailable in Moby Dick. In other words, it's like he unites all of the evil of the world as the kind of emblem of it. He placed upon the whale's white hump the sum of all the general rage and hate felt by his whole race from Adam down. Biblical reference, a sense in which all of the terrible things that have been recorded in humanity from the beginning of time, all of them are in some sense encapsulated in the body of this beast, and therefore he must be struck. And then that line goes, and then, as if his chest had been a mortar, he burst his hot heart's shell upon it. I don't even know how you take the measure of a metaphor like that. I mean, this is totally sort of sui generis, created by Melville. As if his chest had been a mortar, he burst his hot heart's shell upon it. It almost has a scary echo of suicide bomber. It's as if you are a living incendiary, you are a living weapon, munitions. And that's probably the way Ahab sees himself, that he is the counter weapon to this force of evil that is embodied in the white whale. Well, that says something about, again, I think the reach of Melville's own eloquence in finding the right figures and metaphors and tropes to measure the sort of grandeur or perhaps madness of this venture. In mapping out Ahab, and I'm using that word mapping out intentionally because it often looks like a map, Melville creates a kind of archaeology of the soul. It's as if the soul were a kind of layered edifice, and that you explore it, predictably, by going further and further downward. So the map is one thing, that's the surface, but the map then sends you underneath the surface as well, so that you constantly go deeper and deeper and deeper. And this leads Ishmael to reflect on Ahab's mania, and he suggests something quite interesting, it seems to me, which is that Ahab's obsession, his madness, has hijacked his personality. It's usurped his mind and his feelings, and it's reorganized them. It's concentrated them. It's distilled them so that it makes for a kind of frighteningly cogent figure. Everything, of course, is now in the form of this beast that must be slain. But in continuing with my remark about depth, that in a kind of spellbinding passage, we get a sense of Ahab's madness as only being a kind of surface, and this surface is compared to something that nobody else except Melville ever would have come up with, which is the Hôtel de Cluny in Paris. I don't know if you've been to Paris, and it's at the corner of Saint-Germain and Saint-Michel, and it's a medieval building, and we know that underneath it, because you can visit them, are these Roman thermal ruins. And that's the kind of depth image that Melville is getting at for Ahab, that underneath the surface of what you see of this wild madman, you have to go still further down if you are to explore him. And there, as you go further, you find these buried Roman ruins, and among these ruins, you find the torsos of statues, the broken thrones and captive kings. And he says that here then, in the depths, we find these emblems and icons that would figure forth Ahab. Again, it's the characteristic directionality of this book. That notion of the sort of cogency or control of the mind being hijacked is one of Melville's more interesting insights, it seems to me, because it challenges any kind of ownership that we might have. And it's in line, I think, really closer with modern psychology and the kinds of psychiatric disorders that we can have, that are of no one's doing. They have to do with things that go wrong in our system neurologically, or perhaps because of experiences that we've had. But selfhood and ownership are in trouble in this text. And obsession becomes the gauge of when we start to lose control of ourselves, not just of our feelings, that madness becomes quite literally a form of alienation here. And then you get the question, and the book asks it quite specifically, is I, not E-Y-E, but I, the pronoun, is it an agent of our own volition? That's what we want to think. And when I say, I'm going to give this lecture, or I'm going to listen to this lecture, or I'm going to go to town, or I'm going to turn off this lecture, we think of ourselves as the originators of that phrase. But in this text, he leads us to consider whether or not I is simply an instrument of something else that is driving. This is not entirely, I think, different from Freud's model of the unconscious, that there's something within us that we have no access to, and that essentially directs our pulsions or our needs, and that we might live an entire life and never really shed light on it. There are a lot of pages devoted to trying to describe and invoke Ahab's peculiar mania. One of the most beautiful images that he gives is that he compares it to a vulture that feeds on the heart. Of course, this obviously evokes Prometheus, but he also compares it to a Catskill eagle, a particular Catskill eagle that is known for diving into the gorges. And there again you have that depth, going down, probing, sounding. But then he wonderfully writes that a Catskill eagle that dives into the gorges, no matter how far down it goes, is still awfully high up. And so that you're not simply down, but you're also high at the same time. Well, Ahab has a counterpart in this book, and it's not Ishmael. Ishmael is sort of our conduit, our guide. The counterpart is really his opposite number, and we will ultimately, I think, have to begin to think that it's his alter ego, and that's the little black cabin boy, Pip. And in a scene of remarkable beauty, Pip falls overboard. You're talking about going down. He goes down. He goes to the bottom. He goes to the bottom. He's carried alive down to the bottom and sees what there is to see there. The teeming undersea life, its immensity, its variety, its indifference. One could say that he has bottomed out. And what Melville writes is, he saw God's foot upon the treadle of the loom and spoke it, and therefore his shipmates called him mad. Ahab constantly observes Pip, feels that Pip is in a sense his sibling, his alter ego, that Pip is his other. Obviously, from any social or physical point of view, they couldn't be more unlike each other. Now, Pip has been vacated, it seems to me. Pip has been emptied of his rationality, of his mind. He has very few powerful passages, although he has one I'm going to come to in a minute. But I want to return to Ahab. It's unmistakable that Ahab sort of exhibits a kind of megalomania, a single-mindedness and obsessiveness. And I think Melville is out to show us the solipsism of this posture, the tunnel vision of all obsession and mania, that what it achieves in depth and intensity, and perhaps even in truth, it pays the price for being cut off from others and from the world. And what the book makes us see, and for me it's surprising, I hadn't really anticipated this, and I know it to be historically true, by the way, is that these ships in the 19th century that made these voyages for months and months and months, this is not at all as solitary as you might think. They frequently crossed other ships. They exchanged greetings, they exchanged mail. People could even change from ship to ship and go somewhere else. There is a kind of strange, attenuated, but nonetheless real society of ships on the waters. And so the Pequod meets a number of other ships in this novel. And what is intriguing, because Melville goes out of his way to underscore it, is that it gives us a chance to measure once again the obsessiveness, the solipsism, the alienation of Ahab, because he's only got one question. Hast seen the white whale? He doesn't even say, hast thou. Hast seen the white whale? That's what he wants to know over and over and over. Whereas Melville, with considerable wit, gives us a lot of information about some of these other sea captains. In one case, they board the ship, and these people are garrulous fellows, and they want to talk and chat and joke, and Ahab is just sitting there raging. All he wants to do is garner information about Moby Dick. So I think it's Melville's way of showing just what you pay in socialness, in sociability, really in humanity, by being hijacked like this for your obsessions. There's still another way, which is quite bizarre, that Melville enlists to display the monomania, now I'm going to use a particular word, but you'll see why, the cyclopic vision of Ahab. And that is the whale itself, because the book goes out of its way to show us that whales have eyes on the sides of their head, not the way human beings are made, with two eyes that are largely in the front of our head. And this means that the whale cannot see in front of itself, but unlike humans, it can see on both sides. And there's some wonderful paragraphs devoted to that about the peculiar ocular vision of the whale, but it's also a splendid image, it seems to me, of double vision itself, as opposed to the monocular vision, the cyclopic vision, the one-eyed vision of Ahab. I want to segue from there into the argument that I believe this book is meant to be stereophonic. And of course, that's one of the reasons that we have Ishmael. We have Ishmael as our guide. We have Ahab as the towering, domineering, autocratic figure who really, I think, takes over so much of the book. And then we have other characters from whom we hear a certain amount, particularly the mates, Starbuck, and also Stubb and Flask, the second and third mate. And in one of the later passages, it's as if Melville elected to dramatize, almost in theatrical terms, the multiplicity of perspectives that these people give us. All of this is in contrast to Ahab's single-minded vision. And so that's the chapter called the doubloon, where they put this doubloon coin and they post it on a post, and then in kind of really a very schematic way, Melville tells us what each of the major characters thinks as he looks at this doubloon. They all examine it, and then Melville treats us to their thoughts. Before getting into that, let's just recognize that a doubloon, a coin, is one of the great semiotic items in the world. Money is a semiotic launch pad. After all, a bill is not worth very much intrinsically, but it's worth whatever you want it to be in terms of its buying power, in terms of the fantasies that it elicits in the people who crave it, who want to have it, who've lost it. So that money has always been something that sends you somewhere else, that is worth what you could do with it. In fact, this was Marx's critique of money, or at least among his critiques of money. So it's not surprising that you'd have this doubloon as the kind of sounding board or the trampoline from which these people are going to go into their particular visions. Ahab looks at it, and for him, it references the kind of coming storm, all of the turmoil of his life. Starbuck, who is the pious figure on the boat, looks at it and thinks that he can see the Trinity in it. Stubb looks at it, and he thinks about all the things he could buy with this money. He also has a hysterical sequence where it reminds him somehow of astrology, and he goes through all of the astrological figures and signs. Flask looks at it, he's the most prosaic of the group, and he thinks of how many cigars he might be able to buy with it. Others do as well. Queequeg looks at it. And then finally, Pip, the vacated child, the child who is an idiot, who has seen the foot of God in the deeps of the sea. And he's looking at it, and when he looks at it, Ahab looks at him. Ahab wants to know, what is this child who is, in a sense, his alter ego? What is he going to make of it? And he hears Pip talking, and this is what Pip says: I look, you look, he looks, we look, ye look, they look. It's the kind of thing that all of us have gone through when we learn a foreign language. It's like he takes all of the first, second, third, and plural persons and says, looking. This is what the erased Pip, because he's been vacated mentally, he occupies every subject position grammatically here about looking. It's a kind of grammar of interpretation as a madhouse, fruitless looking. We look from every different angle, and what do we find? And this is what Pip says. Here's the ship's navel, this doubloon here, and they are all on fire to unscrew it. But unscrew your navel, and what's the consequence? It's a marvelous line, because if you unscrew your navel, the saying has, your butt falls off, or perhaps your genitals as well. And it's enlisted here as a kind of continuation of this looking from every angle, this sort of interpretive model here, that madness might lie that way as well. Well, I've talked about Ahab, and I've talked about the perspectival nature of the book. I want now to move to what I take to be the richest and most prophetic chapter in the novel. And it's not really, it's Ishmael, it's not Ahab. And it's a chapter that's called The Whiteness of the Whale. And I think it offers us the most provocative view that this book is going to give us of the makings of our world. And in the phrase that I just pronounced, the makings of our world, the word that has to be struck is our. Because what this passage is about is the collapse of any anthropocentric model, any notion that the world is constructed according to human design or human scale. You wouldn't think a chapter called The Whiteness of the Whale would do that. In this chapter, the first thing that Melville does is he explores and then he dismantles the familiar color scheme, which is in fact a semiotic scheme, a sign system, a symbol system that links white, the color white, to a whole host of traditional values that all of us essentially take for granted, values that could be spiritual or aesthetic or obviously racial. White, the innocence of brides. White, the benignity of age. White, one passage says, the white bear of the poles. White, the albatross, and you think about Coleridge's poem. White, the white steed of the prairies, which is a figure of myth. White as death on a pale horse. When Melville wrote his review of Hawthorne, he wrote about the power of blackness, and we know that black has also an extraordinary history. Blackness represents for most of us, in traditional terms, evil. Melville understood that these terms are all arbitrary. They're all signs. They're part of a kind of large network. The history that colors have had is quite a history. Could you dismantle this sign system? Let me interject that Toni Morrison wrote a brilliant book recently about whiteness and blackness as signs, as having their own history, signs that imprison us within their own networks. Well, soon enough after the dismantling has been done so that we see these signs as, in a sense, arbitrary, loaded with symbolic values, but that coexisting with other completely different kinds of symbolic values, we realize that there may be something deeply histrionic here, theatrical. It's as if our symbolic schemes are in cahoots with some sort of illusory histrionic role of colors, and that they construe for us a world of value and variation and delineation and meaning. All of those are full words that I just used. Value, variation, delineation, meaning. That whole grocery list of analogs to white that I gave you, brides, age, the white bear, the albatross, all of those are full. All of those refer to possible meaning systems, signification systems. I started by telling you that this is the chapter that's the most prophetic chapter in the novel. It's the most interrogatory chapter of the novel, because what Melville is going to get to is that the ultimate thing that white points us to is nothing. Nothingness, nullity, And I want to read you part of what I take to be the single most spellbinding passage in the novel about the whiteness of the whale and what whiteness makes us think. He says that it shadows forth the heartless voids and immensities of the universe. Not the brilliant carnival of the universe, but the heartless voids and immensities of the universe, as if the universe were somehow dead, cold, stellar outer space. And he actually says that we get stabbed from behind when we look at white and think about white with the thought of annihilation. That it's this is again the Melvillian imagination, that it goes this far. This is what white is going to make him think. He says that's what you feel if you look at the Milky Way, or at the white depths of the Milky Way. He says then that whiteness is not a color, it's rather the visible absence of color, as well, he says, as it being the concrete of all colors. And he's going to get to the term that he's looking for, which is blankness. Blankness. The blankness that he would see in a snow setting, in a polar setting. He calls it a colorless, all color of atheism, from which we shrink. Whiteness is the erasure of meaning. To use a modern term that Melville wouldn't have used, whiteness is to open the door to a world of the absurd, where there's no pattern, no meaning, just blankness, just nothingness. It's there, but it doesn't mean anything. And then he's going to show us what the sort of implications for our world might be if we think along these lines. And he's going to give us a wonderfully vivid image here of how colored our world is. The sweet tinges of sunset skies and woods, perfect romantic evocation, yea, and the gilded velvets of butterflies, again, a beautiful lyrical image of color. And watch where he goes from butterflies to the butterfly cheeks of young girls. And we think of our notion of carnal beauty, of human beauty, as having color. All these, he says, are but subtle deceits, not actually inherent in substances, but only laid on from without, so that all deified nature absolutely paints like the harlot, as if the natural world we see was just some sort of mascara, some made-up harlot figure, because underneath it there's nothing, whose allurements cover nothing but the charnel house within. This is almost a medieval picture, that the world you see of sumptuous, sensual, beautiful surfaces is a trap, a deceit. All there is the skeleton, and there's much medieval artwork like that. The skeleton, the memento mori, that there's nothing but death behind it all. But that won't stop Melville. He's not interested in some sort of moral statement here. He's interested in something more philosophical. He then is going to call light itself a kind of mystical cosmetic, staying with his imagery of the harlot, the painted harlot. The principle of light forever remains white or colorless in itself, and if operating without medium upon matter, would touch all objects, even tulips and roses, with its own blank tinge. In other words, in certain circumstances, white could be something that reduces the world to ashes. He says the palsied universe lies before us, a leper. That white, in a sense, derealizes the world. It makes us realize that all of the color, which we think of as the vibrancy of the setting that we live in, including ourselves, all of that is a fraud, it's illusory, it's a facade. White is what prompts that. It's one of the grand passages about the whiteness of the whale. It's what Moby Dick at its most extreme suggests. And I'm going to suggest something that Melville does not say, but that I think is consistent with Melville here, which is this operation of turning the world leprous is almost like a cannibalizing operation, that to look at surfaces and then to see through them, to look at human flesh and to see the skeleton behind it. This is what thinking is in Melville. This is what thinking does to the surface of the world. This is what it means when we look at things and we think and we reflect. You remember that passage about looking. I look, you look, he looks. That's what happens in this book. That obsessive thinking, obsessive speculation is something that scalps us in some sense. It turns us into nothing. It turns the world into nothing, into ash. This, I think, is the grand philosophical, absurd conclusion that that passage leads to. It is fortunately not the way the book remains in our mind. The book remains in our mind as an enormously rich, fertile book that can contain even this. Thank you.